Hey guys, tonight we slip into a Rome you've only wandered through in dusty textbooks, and suddenly you're standing barefoot on warm stone while the city hums around you. The air smells like olive oil smoke and crushed basil, and somewhere nearby, a brazier crackles. Soft at first, then loud enough to make you wonder if the flame is staring back. You're here to meet the women who guarded that fire, the Vestal Virgins, and, just a heads up, if you accidentally knock something over in this sacred space, you probably won't survive the evening. Ancient Rome was dramatic like that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our little nighttime map of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You edge forward across the forum, letting its stones press gently against the soles of your imagination. Rome glows with torches tucked into iron brackets, and the city's roar, vendors arguing, soldiers clanking down the Via Sacra, the occasional goat that refuses to cooperate, forms a kind of living lullaby. You drift toward a round temple tucked between larger, louder monuments. It almost looks shy, as if it's whispering, "Come closer, but step softly." Inside, the sacred flame wavers like a golden thread tying Rome's fate to the gods. Historians still argue whether the earliest Romans truly believed that if this flame went out, the whole city would collapse, or if that was just a spectacularly intimidating piece of state propaganda. Either way, you inhale the warm, resin-scented air and feel why the legend mattered. Fire meant life. Fire meant continuity. Fire meant Rome. And there, moving like quiet shadows in ivory robes, you catch your first look at the Vestal Virgins. They don't acknowledge you, of course. Time travel rules are strict, even in bedtime stories. But you sense the weight they carry, the kind of sacred responsibility that would make your modern to-do list look like a couple of post-its stuck to a fridge. Their veils fall over their shoulders like moonlit water, and their braided hair is wrapped in a special style called the sine creens, the same way brides here wear it, though the symbolism couldn't be more different. You let your gaze wander around the temple interior, the polished marble, the bronze fittings, the small, soot-darkened niches where offerings were once tucked. One mainstream fact sneaks into your ear. The Temple of Vesta was one of Rome's oldest religious sites, going back to the city's early monarchy. It wasn't huge or grand like the Jupiter Temple on the Capitoline, but it didn't have to be. Its power was in its purpose. Then, because Rome loves to sprinkle weirdness into your peaceful night, a quirky tidbit arrives. Some ancient writers insisted the sacred flame was tended with a special kind of water that came only from a spring where no sunlight ever touched. Is that true? Maybe. Historians still argue whether that spring existed at all, or whether a poet simply had way too much fun with mythological embellishment. Either way, it adds another shimmer to the mystery glowing around you. As you continue watching the flame dance, you notice something strange. Although the temple is open, the air feels still, as if the wind itself knows better than to meddle with Vesta's business. A Vestal leans forward, gently feeding a sliver of fir wood into the fire. She moves like someone who has done this thousands of times, because she has done this thousands of times. Her 30-year vow of service ensures repetition becomes ritual, and ritual becomes identity. A quiet breeze ripples through the doorway behind you, carrying the smells of warm bread, wet pavement, and whatever perfume wealthy Romans smeared on themselves today. You hear a street musician plucking at a lyre, the soft notes drifting past like fireflies. The combination of the music, the glowing flame, and the drowsy night air presses against your eyelids invitingly. Exactly the vibe you want from a bedtime history wander. Still, your brain, ever the troublemaker, wonders why Rome put so much trust in a group of young women. If you asked a Roman statesman, he'd probably say something like, "Purity safeguards the city," while adjusting his toga dramatically. But beneath the theatrics was a practical truth. The Vestals served as symbols of stability in a world that could turn chaotic faster than a chariot losing a wheel. You feel that expectation humming under your feet, a kind of civic heartbeat. You step back out into the forum for a moment, letting the night breeze cool your face. Columns loom overhead like enormous trees made of stone, their capitals catching tiny bits of moonlight. A stray dog trots past you, glancing back as if to say, "Don't follow me unless you have snacks," before vanishing into the shadows. On a balcony above the marketplace, a family lingers, talking softly while picking at the last bits of their dinner. Rome never fully sleeps. She just yawns loudly and stretches. Standing here, you picture the Vestals weaving through this same space during the day, protected by laws that gave them unusual privileges. But that's for later. Right now, all you have is this moment. You, the temple, the flame, and the faint understanding that you're standing at the threshold of a story that spans centuries. You glance back at the round temple one last time this evening. The flame pulses, steady and bright, promising continuity you can almost touch. Somewhere deep inside you, the warmth sinks into your ribs, like slipping into a bed that remembers your shape. And before the narrative carries you deeper into the lives of the Vestals, you take a slow breath, letting the ancient air fill your lungs, and you step forward, ready for the next part of the journey. You drift onward through the Roman night, letting the hum of the Forum fall behind you as your steps take you toward a quieter memory, one that belongs not to the grown Vestals you just observed, but to the children they once were. You feel the shift in atmosphere instantly, as though time itself has guided you into a smaller, gentler world. Somewhere distant the sacred flame still breathes, but here the air smells of beeswax and laurel leaves, and the sounds are muted, like you've stepped into the moments before a life changes forever. You're standing near a cluster of Roman homes just after dawn. The skies are pale grey-blue, still deciding whether it wants to wake up, and the city hasn't yet started its daily shouting matches. You hear a rooster, the scratch of sandals on packed dirt, and the tiny clinks of kitchen pots warming up. And then you see her, a little girl, maybe 6, maybe 10, depending on which historian you trust. She's playing with a carved wooden doll that has long, jointed arms. The girl giggles as she makes it wobble like a lopsided senator. Cute now, but you sense the doll won't stay with her much longer. Because today she's being watched. A lictor, one of those guys who carries a bundle of sticks and acts extremely important about it, stands across the street. With him is a priest of the Pontifex Maximus, the High Priest of Rome. The pair murmurs quietly, occasionally glancing toward the girl, and you can practically hear their thoughts echoing. Is she right? Is she suitable? Will she serve the goddess well? Historians still argue whether the selection of Vestals was a solemn religious process, or whether politics slid its greasy fingers all over it. But either way, this moment is decisive. Your presence shifts a little closer as the girl's mother calls her inside. You follow as the scent of bread dough and old stone fills the doorway. Inside, the family speaks softly, almost reverently. The father straightens his tunic nervously. He knows this isn't like getting your kid into an elite school, although to be fair, the Vestals were basically the Ivy League of holiness. Once chosen, their daughter will leave home for decades. She may return someday, wealthy and respected, but she will not belong to them anymore. As the priest enters, the girl's eyes widen. The doll falls silent in her hands. He speaks gently. This part surprises you, given ancient Rome's usual enthusiasm for yelling, and tells her about the honour of tending Vesta's flame. Quirky tidbit for you. Some ancient sources insist that only girls with 2 living parents qualified, as if the goddess refused to work with incomplete family paperwork. Others argue that rules shifted constantly depending on how many spots needed filling. Bureaucracy, it seems, is eternal. You watch the moment her fate clicks into place. She doesn't fully understand it. How could she? She only knows that. Adults suddenly look at her like she's a rare bird perched on their windowsill. She clutches her doll a little tighter. Maybe she's thrilled. Maybe she's terrified. Maybe she's wondering if this means she can get out of doing her household chores forever. Historians still argue whether girls this young understood the weight of their vows, or whether the significance sank in years later, like dye bleeding slowly into cloth. Stepping back outside, you trail behind the small procession as they lead her toward the Forum. A few neighbours peek out of their windows. Some nod approvingly, others whisper superstitious fears. A passing merchant gestures for good luck, tapping the side of a bronze amulet. Meanwhile, the girl looks around with the expression of someone who was promised a treat, but isn't entirely sure she's going to like it. As you walk, the streets widen. Rome wakes up around you. Vendors start shouting their deals for olives, wine, salted fish, and whatever that questionable stew is over there. A donkey brays like it just heard the world's worst joke. 2 kids chase a hoop down the road, nearly colliding with the solemn little parade. It's chaos as usual, yet the girl moves through it like a tiny bright thread in a very large tapestry. Eventually you arrive at the house of the Vestal's entrance. The girl hesitates. Her mother touches her shoulder lightly, and you feel that universal parental ache, letting go even when it hurts. The priest motions and the child steps over the threshold. In a simple, symbolic gesture, she hands over her doll. Yes, that same wobbly-limbed one you saw earlier. It will be stored or offered, depending on the custom of the day. Either way, it marks the end of her childhood. A senior Vestal kneels before her and places a veil over her head. The fabric is light but weighted with meaning, and she adjusts it awkwardly, like kids do when you make them wear formal clothes. Her hair will soon be braided into the semi-creen style. She'll be given a new name that aligns her with Vesta, separating her from her birth family. Not a bad deal if you want free food, a personal maid, and the legal ability to pardon condemned prisoners by accidentally brushing past them. But we'll get to those powers later. For now, you sense the girl's confusion mixing with wonder. She is entering a world where the mundane transforms into the sacred, where fetching water, grinding meal, or tending fire becomes infused with spiritual consequence, where silence carries more weight than speeches. It's a world where she'll grow up surrounded only by women who share her fate, becoming her sisters, her teachers, and sometimes her cautionary tales. A soft dawn breeze curls around you as she takes her first steps into this new life. The senior Vestal gives her a reassuring nod, then gestures toward the inner courtyard. You follow, watching her tiny sandals shuffle over the polished floors, her gaze flickering between fear and determination. She doesn't know it, but her service will span wars, festivals, political upheavals, and probably more drama than a modern reality show. As the door closes between her and her old world, you feel the symbolic thud of transformation. A child has been chosen, a vow has begun, and somewhere in the temple nearby, the sacred flame flickers just a little brighter, welcoming its newest guardian. You follow the girl, now a novice Vestal, deeper into the house of the Vestals, feeling the way the building seems to swallow sound. The moment the heavy door settles behind you, the city's noisy heartbeat fades into a distant murmur. It's like stepping into a Roman version of noise-cancelling headphones, except these ones come with a 30-year contract you definitely can't unsubscribe from. The air is cool, smelling faintly of stone dust, olive oil, and the wax used to seal storage jars. And as you tread softly along the smooth floor, you realize something. This place isn't just where Vestals live, it's where they transform. 30 years, that's the vow. You hear it whispered in the rustle of robes, in the measured footsteps echoing through the hall. The girl you saw chosen is now standing before the senior Vestal, who explains what those 3 decades mean. Her voice is calm, almost soothing, like someone reading bedtime stories while simultaneously reminding you of the unbreakable contract you just signed. The vow outlines 3 distinct phases: 10 years learning, 10 years performing rituals, and 10 years teaching. Historians still argue whether this structure was strictly enforced or more of a guideline that priests used depending on who was available and awake that day. You drift around the novice as she listens, trying to imagine 30 years of anything. 30 years without choosing your own clothes, 30 years without going wherever you want, 30 years of sleeping in a place where the walls probably judge you, and of course, the most famous condition, absolute chastity. One mainstream fact rises gently in your mind. Breaking that vow wasn't just a personal failure in Rome, it was considered a crime against the state. The Romans believed a Vestal's purity protected the city itself. If she broke it, Rome was spiritually compromised, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Not exactly the kind of rule you'd want to test. Still, tucked into all the solemnity is a quirky tidbit you almost miss. Ancient writers claim that if a Vestal accidentally let the sacred flame go out, she'd be beaten with a rod by the Pontifex Maximus, but only in darkness and silence. The logic? Darkness prevented it from becoming a spectacle, and silence made sure no one reported how awkward the whole situation probably was. Whether this was routine practice or just one historian being dramatic, scholars still debate. You sense the novice's shoulders lift as she inhales deeply. Her childhood is already fading. Behind her, replaced by a future that stretches out like the long shadow of an afternoon sun. A senior Vestal places a hand on her back, guiding her into a small room filled with shelves of scrolls. Here, her education begins, not just in religious rituals, but in reading, writing, managing sacred property, and understanding Rome's sprawling calendar of festivals. You watch as she tentatively touches a wax tablet, pressing the stylus to its soft surface. She'll learn record-keeping, grain distribution, ceremonial timing, and all the things Roman bureaucrats loved arguing about. As you wander past the shelves, you hear two older Vestals murmuring about state affairs. You catch snippets of political names and property disputes, and it dawns on you that these women, though cloistered, are surprisingly plugged into the machinery of Rome. They are trusted guardians of documents, witnesses in trials, and figures whose presence can shift public mood. You didn't expect the vibe to be sacred nun meets civic power broker, but here we are. The novice, meanwhile, is introduced to the courtyard where she'll spend much of her life. At its centre glimmers a small sacred fountain, sending out soft echoes that dance around the open space. Ivy creeps along the walls in lazy spirals, as though it's too comfortable to rush. A few Vestals sit nearby weaving garlands for ritual use, their fingers moving with practiced certainty. One of them looks up and gives the novice a gentle half-smile. Another Vestal sneezes, startling a pigeon, your first light joke moment of the section. Even sacred priestesses are no match for Roman dust. You take in the atmosphere, calm, orderly, but quietly intense. Every object here seems charged with meaning. The brooms for sweeping the temple aren't just cleaning tools, they're ceremonial instruments. The water jugs aren't for simple hydration, they're part of purification rites. The statues standing in alcoves are reminders that Vesta isn't the kind of goddess you try to impress with elaborate myths. She's steady, humble, and expects the same from her guardians. As the novice walks along the perimeter of the courtyard, she passes a mosaic that catches your attention. Its tiles shimmer in the afternoon light, forming swirling patterns like flames curling around a hearth. You kneel to trace the edge. Well, metaphorically, because we're keeping things PG-13 and historically tidy, and you sense the way this building is designed to constantly remind its residents of their purpose. Every corner, every sound, every daily rhythm reinforces the vow. But even within this sacred world, the novice will grow, laugh, learn, and stumble like any other human. You notice her glancing at the older Vestals with a mixture of awe and, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? She's not alone. Many of them felt terrified at first, but over the years the fear becomes familiarity, and the vow becomes identity. Some would later describe their time here as a source of deep pride. Others may have felt trapped. Historians, surprise, surprise, still argue whether the life of a Vestal was empowering or restrictive. You watch her sit near the fountain, dipping her fingers into the cool water. She examines her reflection, the veil, the bare forehead where her hair will soon be parted into ritual braids, the soft uncertainty in her eyes. She doesn't yet know how strong she'll become, or how many ceremonial fires she'll keep alive. But she has taken her first step, and now the years ahead wait like pages in a long scroll she cannot yet read. The sunlight shifts, warming the marble beneath you. Somewhere outside, Rome begins another afternoon filled with bustling markets and clattering carts. But inside these walls, the novice's journey has just begun, a quiet beginning for a life that will intertwine with the fate of the empire. You ease yourself further into the house of the Vestals, letting the light from the courtyard fade as you wander down a cool corridor that curves gently inward. The air shifts, quieter, deeper, almost meditative, and you realize you've stepped into the private heart of the Vestal's world. The atrium house stretches around you like a self-contained universe, sealed off from the chaos of Rome outside. You can almost hear the city trying to shout through the walls, but here, the stone simply absorbs the noise and hums back with a steady calm. The novice you've been following pads softly across the mosaic floor, her steps echoing like small ripples in a still pond. You drift behind her, and the first room you pass is simple but elegant. Sleeping chambers lined along a long hallway. These aren't dormitory bunks or cramped cells. Vestals had private rooms, actual personal space, which in Rome is basically the equivalent of being handed a VIP pass. The walls are washed in soft earth tones, with tiny flickers of painted vine patterns near the ceilings. You catch the faint scent of laurel, maybe from a satchel hung by a bedpost, a little domestic charm tucked into a life ruled by ritual. One mainstream historical fact slides into place as you take in the architecture. Archaeologists have identified multiple renovations of this house, especially during the imperial period, showing just how invested Rome's leaders were in keeping the Vestals comfortable. The place had courtyards, fountains, statues, even heated floors in some eras. Yes, heated floors. The Romans invented underfloor heating, proving once again they refused to suffer cold toes even in sacred spaces. As you wander with the novice, she peers into her assigned room. It's sparsely furnished. A bed with simple linen, a chest for robes, a shelf for scrolls. A small oil lamp flickers in the corner, making the shadows dance lazily on the walls. She runs a hand over the smooth wood of the chest, maybe wondering how long it will take before this room feels less like a guest chamber and more like hers. You can almost read the thought in her nervous shoulders. 30 years is a long time to sleep in the same place. A Vestal in her mid-20s appears in the doorway. Calm, composed, robes immaculate like she wakes up perfectly folded every morning. She gestures for the novice to follow her deeper inside. You join them, stepping into a spacious communal area where Vestals weave garlands, mend robes, and occasionally exchange low murmurs that sound suspiciously like gossip, which shouldn't surprise you. Just because they vow chastity doesn't mean they vow silence. Even sacred priestesses need to vent about somebody stealing the good honey cakes. A quirky tidbit floats into your head as you look around. Ancient sources claim the Vestals kept a sacred storage area filled with objects so bizarre that no one, not even priests, could agree on what half of them were. Some said the Palladium, a statue supposedly tied to Troy, was hidden here. Others swore they guarded ritual implements like a magical golden sieve that wouldn't spill water. Historians still argue whether these objects ever existed or whether Roman writers simply enjoyed adding mystery box energy to the Vestal's reputation. The novice watches two older Vestals prepare incense for an evening ritual. One gently crushes frankincense resin with a small bronze pestle, releasing a citrusy, pine-sweet scent that floats upward in lazy curls. Another sorts small bundles of herbs, rosemary, myrtle, and something that smells suspiciously like the Roman version of oregano. The mixture will cleanse the temple and the flame, but its aroma also doubles as ancient Rome's answer to scented candles, cozy and sacred all at once. As you settle beside the fountain that anchors the atrium, you notice how the water catches the light from the open sky above. It reflects like a tiny piece of daytime trapped inside the house. The novice reaches into the pool, letting cool water drip down her fingers. Then she notices a mosaic along the edge, a depiction of Vesta's flame curling upward in swirling reds and golds. Her eyes linger on it. You sense the dawning realization. She's not just living in a house, she's living inside a symbol. Nearby, two Vestals are measuring grain with a wooden scoop, preparing offerings for the next morning. Their movements are rhythmic, practiced, almost hypnotic. It's the kind of pleasant repetition that could make anyone drowsy, especially if you've been wandering ancient Rome all evening. One Vestal flicks a bit of grain at another as a joke, and the other shoots her a mock glare before hiding a smile. There's life here, warmth beneath the ritual strictness. As you continue wandering through the atrium, you pass a small kitchen. A pot simmers over a low fire, and the smell makes your stomach rumble. Something lentilish, something garlicky, something ancient but surprisingly appetizing. The cook, a servant assigned to the Vestals, hums softly as she stirs. The novice watches with interest. After all, she'll spend years doing tasks like grinding meal and carrying water herself. Sacred duties? Yes, but plenty of domestic ones too. Even Rome's holiest women still had chores. You wander into another corner of the house where scrolls are stored on wooden racks, each labelled with neat wax tablets. Some contain ritual instructions. Others record property inventories or temple expenses. A few are political documents entrusted to the Vestals for safekeeping, proof of just how much the state relied on them. You drift your fingers above the scrolls, feeling the weight of centuries of record-keeping humming softly in the air. The novice pauses at a window overlooking the forum. From inside the atrium house, the city looks distant, almost unreal. You can't hear the arguments over fish prices or the clatter of carts. You can't smell the leather workers or the street food sizzling on portable braziers. All of Rome's bustle becomes a distant painting framed by stone, and the novice seems to understand. This silence is part of the vow. But silence doesn't mean isolation. A group of Vestals gathers at the fountain and beckons her over. One hands her a small copper bowl and shows her how to wash her hands in ritual sequence. Right, then left, then right again. Simple movements, yet precise, almost like learning choreography. She tries, fumbles a bit. Water splashes her sleeve. A younger Vestal giggles, not unkindly, and hands her a cloth. "You'll get it," she seems to say with her eyes. You feel the gentle humour of the moment soften the air, one of those tiny scenes that reminds you the Vestals were human long before they were symbols. A ray of sunlight slides across the courtyard, settling warmly on the novice's face. In that glow, she looks both fragile and fierce, like a spark that's only just beginning to grow into flame. The atrium house embraces her, not with loud ceremony, but with quiet routine. The kind of routine that shapes a life slowly, carefully, endlessly. Here, surrounded by carved columns, trickling fountains, and women who have lived this vow far longer than she has breathed it, the novice begins to understand her new world. A world of discipline and dignity, a world of sisterhood and solitude, a world where 30 years is both an eternity and a single heartbeat. And as the afternoon sun dips a little lower, you follow her into the next stretch of this long sacred journey, letting the echoes of the atrium house settle into your own sense of calm. You follow the novice Vestal as she steps out of the atrium house and toward the round structure you first visited, the Temple of Vesta itself. But this time you're not hovering like a curious tourist. You're moving with purpose, slipping into her perspective as she begins to learn the most critical responsibility of her entire service, keeping the eternal flame alive. It's early morning now, the sky's peach gold, soft as warm bread, and the temple entrance casts a curved shadow across the forum like an eyelid half opened in prayer. She pauses at the threshold. A senior Vestal stands beside her, nodding toward the flame with a look that says, "This is the heartbeat of Rome. Don't mess it up." You can almost feel the weight of those words settle on the novice's shoulders like a heavy cloak, one she'll wear for decades. Inside, the flame burns with that same shimmering intensity you saw earlier. Bright, steady, a little dramatic, exactly as you'd expect from something the Romans believed could doom the entire city if extinguished. One mainstream fact glows to life here. The sacred fire wasn't fueled by just any wood. The Vestals used carefully selected pieces from specific trees, dried and prepared with almost obsessive precision. The goddess Vesta was all about order, so no sloppy, fire-tending allowed. The senior Vestal guides the novice closer. The heat prickles against her face, and she squints slightly, trying not to look nervous. A bronze shovel, a rake-like tool, and a small basket of kindling sit nearby, all arranged like a ceremonial toolkit. They're polished, well used, and faintly warm from the night's work. "Watch," the senior murmurs. She kneels, graceful, deliberate, and stirs the fire with a rake-like hook. Sparks scatter upward like tiny fireflies, briefly illuminating the carved wooden beams overhead. She adds a sliver of fir wood, then a pinch of sacred salt. The flame responds instantly, dancing higher as though showing off for the new arrival. The novice studies every movement, probably thinking, "Okay, this doesn't look too hard, right? Just fire." And that's when reality whispers back. This isn't just fire. This is the flame that symbolized Rome's eternal existence. If the flame died, the city's luck died with it. And if you were the Vestal on duty when that happened, well, good luck to you and your chastity vow. A quirky tidbit nudges into the scene. Some ancient writers insisted the sacred flame had no smoke, as if it were a divine fire immune to normal combustion rules. Did it truly burn smokeless? Historians still argue whether this was poetic exaggeration, or whether specific woods were chosen to produce minimal smoke. Either way, it gave the flame a mystical aura. One more reason you're half convinced it knows when you're watching. Now it's the novice's turn. She kneels beside the fire, fingers trembling slightly as she picks up the hook. She moves slowly, cautiously, too cautiously. The tool barely taps the embers, causing almost no shift in the flame. The senior Vestal hides a smile, not mocking but patient, and guides her hand with gentle pressure. A few embers scatter and the novice nearly jumps back. The senior calmly steadies her. You feel the moment settle, fear meeting instruction, uncertainty meeting ritual. She tries again, and this time, when she feeds a thin branch into the flame, the fire licks it with a soft hiss, accepting her offering. Outside, the forum is beginning to wake. Voices murmur, footsteps swell. A pair of roosters seem to be in a competitive crowing contest no one asked for. But inside the temple, everything feels suspended in a slow, intentional rhythm. Each movement has meaning. Each sound, even the crackle of the fire, is part of the ceremony. The novice glances up at the small circular opening in the roof, the compluvium, where sunlight drips down in a pale beam that falls across the flame like a blessing. Dust motes drift lazily in the column of light. You catch yourself watching them, mesmerized, and almost forget your job is to follow the narrative, not float off into ASMR dust particle appreciation. But the flame pulls your attention back. It always does. The senior Vestal explains more of the rules. No blowing on the flame. No letting outsiders touch the tools. No letting the fire burn too high or too low. The novice nods rapidly, absorbing every word like a sponge made of anxiety and ambition. After all, her entire reputation and Rome's spiritual stability hinges on her ability to keep this fire alive. Then comes the more ceremonial part, the ritual cleansing of the hearth. A small brush of pine twigs is used to sweep the edges of the circular altar. The novice watches carefully, learning the sequence. Left side first, then right, then a gentle clockwise sweep around the perimeter. The sweep must be smooth, uninterrupted. If she drops the brush, no catastrophe, but definitely a moment the other Vestals will lovingly tease her about later. You catch another historian debate floating into your thoughts. Scholars still argue whether Vestals tended the flame in strict shifts, or whether responsibilities rotated more fluidly, depending on festivals, omens, or political moods. What you see today suggests a combination of routine and ritual sensitivity, like tending a sacred pet that occasionally has opinions. The novice is finally given a chance to sweep. She holds her breath as she moves the pine brush along the cool stone, careful, gentle. A few stray bristles whisper across the marble. She finishes the sweep and looks up, waiting for approval like a puppy expecting a treat. The senior Vestal nods. The novice beams, subtle but proud. Around the temple, other Vestals begin arriving for their own duties. One carries a clay jar of fresh water for purification. Another brings a bowl of meal for offerings. Their footsteps sound soft, almost muffled, as if the temple itself insists on quiet. The novice watches them closely. How they move, how they breathe, how they seem to melt into the rhythm of the flame. She's beginning to understand the unspoken rule. Tending the fire isn't about perfection, it's about presence. A city could fall into chaos outside. A senator could throw a sandal at his rival. A merchant could swear he's selling authentic Greek olive oil, even though you saw him refill the jars with something suspiciously local. But inside this round sanctuary the flame remains steady, and so must its guardians. As the morning ritual winds down, the novice sits near the altar, absorbing the warmth. The flame crackles softly, like a quiet voice telling her she belongs here now. And for the first time since you saw her leave her childhood home, you see her shoulders relax. She hasn't mastered the flame, not yet, but she's taken the first step, and tomorrow she'll take another, and another, until eventually she won't just tend the fire, she'll be its keeper, its protector, its partner in ritual, its quiet, steady mirror. And as the sun rises over Rome, the flame glows brighter, as if acknowledging her first small victory. You trail the novice Vestal as she exits the temple, her cheeks still warm from the fire, her fingers still tingling from the careful ritual she performed. But her day isn't slowing down. If anything, it's shifting gears, moving from tending the flame to tending herself, because in the world of the Vestals, purity isn't a philosophical vibe. It's a full-time maintenance schedule, complete with rules, rinses, restrictions, and the occasional, wait, we have to purify that too moment. She steps into a shaded walkway behind the Temple of Vesta, where a small stream-fed fountain bubbles quietly. The air here smells fresher, cool mineral water, damp stone, and the faint sharpness of crushed mint. A senior Vestal gestures toward the fountain, and the novice kneels beside it, cupping the water in her hands. She lets it trickle over her fingers, cleansing away ash, sweat, and perhaps a whisper of nervousness still clinging from her temple initiation. This isn't just about washing up. One mainstream fact rises gently to the surface. Vestals were required to maintain ritual purity at all times, which meant regular cleansing with water drawn from sacred springs, especially the Aqua Appia, one of Rome's oldest aqueduct sources. And purification couldn't come from just any bucket hauled out of the Tiber. That river was the ancient equivalent of everything your city health department warns you about. As the novice rubs the water across her wrists and face, the senior Vestal murmurs instructions about upcoming purification cycles, daily, weekly, festival-based, and those reserved for special emergencies, like omens suddenly going, "Uh-oh," or the sacred fire acting moody. You notice small copper bowls arranged neatly beside the fountain. Some contain salt, others hold herbs, myrtle leaves, laurel fragments, even a few slender twigs of juniper. A quirky tidbit drifts your way. Some purification rituals required sweeping the floor with a broom made of fresh, unburnt twigs that had to be cut during a specific moon phase. Was the moon doing anything special? Who knows? Historians still argue whether this detail was superstition or symbolic timing, or just someone's attempt to justify going out at night to pick sticks. The novice dips her fingers into a shallow bowl of salted water, swirling it gently. The grains dissolve slowly, catching the sunlight in little sparkles like underwater stars. The salt purifies, she's told, but it also represents the preservation of Rome's fortune. She takes it in quietly. You can almost see her brain spinning. Okay, so fire, water, salt. This vow is starting to feel like an elemental-themed escape room. A bell chimes softly from deeper in the compound. Another summons. But before the novice rises, a senior Vestal places a small clay jar in her hands. Inside is mola salsa, a sacred salted flour mixture the Vestals prepare each year during the festival of the Vestalia. The jar is sealed with wax, but even so, the faint smell of toasted grain seeps through. It's warm, earthy, comforting, like the Roman version of fresh sourdough. This mixture is essential for purification rituals used to bless animals, tools, even entire households. The novice lifts the jar with intense care like it contains something explosive, which, ritualistically speaking, it does. As she stands, you follow her into a dimmer room where several Vestals gather around a low marble table. On the surface sits a folded bundle of linen, crisp, spotless, absolutely unwrinkled, in a way that suggests someone has supernatural ironing skills. The senior Vestal unravels it, revealing fresh robes for the novice. The garments are white, pure, bright, the colour of quiet discipline. They smell faintly of lavender and something resinous, maybe frankincense. Changing into these robes is part of her purification, so she steps behind a screen. You hear the soft shuffle of linen and the faint clink of small fasteners. The moment she emerges, something subtle has changed. She looks lighter. Not like she's floating, but like she's shed a tiny layer of the outside world. A Vestal gently adjusts her veil, pulling it forward so it rests just above her brow. The fabric falls in soft folds, framing her face with solemn elegance. The senior Vestal inspects the drape, tugging it once, nodding in satisfied approval. Then comes the hair. The novice sits on a low stool while another Vestal stands behind her, separating her hair into the famous senecrins, the 6 braids style traditionally worn by brides. Except here, the symbolism isn't marital bliss, it's devotion, it's discipline, it's the public proclamation of her vow. As her hair is braided, the rhythm of the Vestal's fingers is soothing, like someone weaving both strands and significance together. While they work, 2 Vestals murmur about omens seen earlier in the week. Something about lightning striking near the Palatine Hill. You perk up at that. Romans were so obsessed with omens that they'd probably interpret your hiccup as a sign from Jupiter. Historians still argue whether these omens influenced daily Vestal routines or whether temple priests mostly used them as convenient excuses to reschedule things they didn't want to do. Once the braids are wrapped and secured with woolen ribbons, the novice stands. She looks older, not in years, but in presence. Like the braids have anchored her to something bigger than herself. Her reflection in a polished bronze mirror shows a girl stepping into a role meant for a guardian, a symbol, a servant of a hearth older than the city around her. But purification isn't over yet. The senior Vestal hands her a small dish of incense, brittle chunks of resin, pale and translucent. The novice pinches a piece between her fingers, raises it to her forehead, and breathes in deeply. The scent is sweet and sharp at once. She lowers the incense onto a tiny coal, and it curls upward in a lazy wisp, drifting toward the ceiling. The smoke bathes her face, her hair, her robes, tracing invisible lines of protection and renewal. She closes her eyes. You watch the smoke swirl, feeling the air thicken with a warm, comforting aroma. There's something meditative about it, something slow and grounding. For a moment, you let yourself drift too. The soft crackle of the coal, the whisper of robes, the muffled hum of the fountain outside. It all blends into a sleepy rhythm that makes your eyelids droop. But purification ends with movement, not stillness. The novice is guided to a small altar at the back of the room. She places her hands lightly upon its edge, murmuring a short prayer. You don't need to hear the words to know what it expresses. Readiness, devotion, and maybe a tiny bit of, please don't let me mess up in front of everyone. A final bowl of water is passed around. Each Vestal dips her fingers and sprinkles a few droplets onto the floor. An offering, a symbolic sweeping away of impurity. The droplets hit the marble with soft taps, like tiny raindrops rehearsing for a storm that will never come. And then, with everything cleansed, the tools, the robes, the mind, the novice steps back into the main hall, looking refreshed and just a little more connected to her role. Purity here isn't about perfection. It's about intention, ritual, repetition, presence. And as she walks calmly toward the next part of her training, the soft glow of the sacred flame reflects off her newly arranged braids, making them look almost like threads of light woven into her hair. You follow the novice Vestal as she's guided through a narrow corridor, past the courtyard fountain, past the storeroom with its shelves of carefully labelled jars, until the air suddenly feels heavier, denser, like you've stepped into a place that's been holding its breath for centuries. The senior Vestal leading her slows, placing a hand on a bronze door that looks deceptively plain. Its hinges bear the marks of constant use, but its surface has been polished so often you can almost see your reflection wavering in it like a ghost. This, she explains, is the entrance to the sanctuary vault, the private chamber where Rome stores some of its most sacred objects. Not the gold and jewels you might expect from kings and conquerors, but items whose importance rests quietly, invisibly, on the foundation of Rome's myths. The novice swallows hard. You can't blame her. Even you feel the hush in your lungs, like speaking above a whisper might accidentally summon a curse or, worse, an audit from the Pontifex Maximus. The door creaks open, releasing a cool, earthy scent. Old stone, aged wood, a faint trace of incense absorbed into the walls over centuries. Inside, the room is dim except for a few oil lamps burning steadily. Their light flickers across shelves stacked with objects whose shapes shift in and out of clarity. Some wrapped in cloth, some boxed in carved cedar, some displayed openly as if daring you to question their reality. The novice steps inside with careful, almost tiptoeing strides. It's not fear so much as reverence. She's been told about this place, of course, but hearing about Rome's sacred treasures isn't the same as standing 3 feet from them while your brain whispers, "Don't sneeze. If you sneeze and knock something over, they will rebuild the city without you." At the center of the room rests a wooden chest, not ornate, not gilded, just quietly imposing. The senior Vestal lifts the lid slightly, not enough to reveal everything, just enough for the novice to glimpse something wrapped in layers of fabric. She explains that some believe this chest holds the Palladium, a small statue supposedly brought from Troy and tied to the safety of the city. One mainstream fact here: Roman tradition claimed that as long as the Palladium remained in the city, Rome itself could not fall. It was a mythic insurance policy kept in the hands of the Vestals. But here's where things get interesting. Historians still argue whether the Palladium actually existed, or whether it was a symbolic term for multiple sacred items kept together. Some even suggest the Romans secretly replaced it with a decoy at some point, like a sacred version of switching a real diamond with a fake one at a museum. You can almost imagine a priest whispering, "Shh, no one tell the barbarians." Nearby, another shelf holds several curious items: a set of bronze keys, a tightly woven basket, and small clay figures whose features have blurred with age. One quirky tidbit for you. Some ancient authors insisted that one of the sacred objects stored here was a magical sieve that could hold water without spilling. You stare at a sieve-like item on the shelf, half convinced it's judging you for doubting its supernatural credentials. The novice watches silently as the senior Vestal points out the objects one by one. She doesn't touch anything yet. You don't handle sacred artifacts until you've mastered the rituals that protect both them and you from mishandling. Instead, she observes, absorbing details like the way the cedar chest smells faintly of resin, or how each cloth wrapping is folded with mathematical precision, as if the women who tended them understood that order is its own form of prayer. The senior Vestal leads her to a smaller alcove separated by a low archway. Here, the objects look more everyday. Pots, jars, bowls, scoops, but all bear traces of ritual use. These are tools, she explains, used for preparing offerings, grinding sacred meal, measuring out incense. The novice kneels to examine a jar whose surface is etched with tiny markings, possibly tally notations, possibly ancient doodles, possibly the earliest known instance of someone bored at work. Scholars still argue which interpretation is more likely. She picks up a small bronze ladle, carefully with 2 hands, and the weight surprises her. It's heavier than it looks. The metal holds the warmth of the room, and the handle is smooth from centuries of use. For a moment, she seems lost in the feeling of connection, like she's holding a link not just to Rome's past, but to every Vestal who ever served before her. The ladle is nothing extraordinary to the eye, yet entirely extraordinary in meaning. You drift behind her as she explores more shelves. One holds scrolls, their edges darkened with age. These aren't state documents, but ritual instructions. Recipes for sacred mixtures, pandemic-level hygiene guidelines for temple tools, and ceremonial checklists that probably stress-test even the most organized mind. You imagine a Vestal centuries ago muttering, "Did we rotate the grain jars counterclockwise again? Where's the list? Who moved the list?" On another shelf rests a collection of objects that look almost random. A small carved wolf figurine, a bundle of dried reeds, a knotted rope, and a smooth stone worn into a natural oval. Their meanings aren't explained. Perhaps they're too old for anyone to remember, or perhaps their significance is so deeply woven into ritual that explanation isn't necessary. The novice tilts her head, curious, but the senior Vestal only smiles with the serene ambiguity of someone who's been answering the same question for 20 years. The room's silence feels alive, like a soft animal breathing. You sense the weight of centuries settling around the novice as she stands in the semi-darkness. These shelves hold more than objects. They hold memory, faith, identity. The intangible wrapped in the tangible. Then the senior Vestal closes the cedar chest gently. The sound echoes like a heartbeat in the quiet vault. She explains that guarding these artifacts isn't about protecting them from thieves. The sanctuary is sacred, protected by law and custom. It's about maintaining the ritual continuity that defines Rome. As long as these objects endure, so does the city's sense of itself. And the novice finally understands. Her job isn't just tending fire or performing rites, it's safeguarding Rome's spiritual anchor, its mythic core. As the bronze door swings shut behind them, the novice exhales softly, as if releasing a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The senior Vestal places a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You'll learn it all," she whispers, and with that the novice steps back into the sunlight, carrying with her the quiet gravity of the vault, mystery, duty, and the knowledge that some secrets are older than cities. You follow the novice Vestal out into the open courtyard just as the air begins to hum with anticipation. There's a different energy in Rome today, a brightness, a liveliness, as if the whole city has taken a deep breath and is now ready to burst into celebration. The novice doesn't know it yet, but she's about to experience her first Vestalia, the festival dedicated to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. If tending the flame was her introduction to duty, this is her introduction to joy. The senior Vestal motions for her to follow, and together you step through the archway that leads out into the forum. The change is immediate and overwhelming. Rome is awake, fully, loudly, enthusiastically awake. Vendors are setting up stalls draped with garlands of freshly cut flowers. Millers arrive carrying baskets of flour so fine it practically glows in the morning sun. And everywhere you turn, women move with purpose. each wearing simple white garments tied with plain cords, honouring the goddess of domestic life. A mainstream fact rises into your mind. During the Vestalia, the normally closed inner sanctum of the Temple of Vesta was open to women, only women, allowing them to make offerings for their homes and families. It was one of the few times ordinary Roman women could access this sacred space. The city felt different during this festival, lighter, more feminine, more connected to the quiet rituals of daily life. You drift behind the novice as she watches the preparations, eyes wide. Today isn't about solemn duties. Today is celebration paired with ceremony. A blend of noise and reverence. Even the sacred flame seems to burn with extra enthusiasm, like it knows it's getting special attention. A group of older Vestals gather near a long table covered with offerings, trays of cakes made from mola salsa. Yes, the same sacred flour mixture you saw earlier. Small bowls of fruit, sprigs of herbs tied with knotted thread, and round loaves printed with tiny stamped designs. The novice's gaze lingers on one loaf shaped like a small donkey. You can't help but smile. The donkey was Vesta's sacred animal, symbolizing patience and domestic strength. Also, the donkey once saved Vesta from a drunken prank by Priapus, an awkward myth the Romans mostly avoided explaining to children. You'll be relieved to know we're keeping things PG-13 tonight. A quirky tidbit floats toward you through the crowd. During the Vestalia, millers and bakers would sprinkle their donkeys with wreaths of flowers and let them take the day off. Some writers say the donkeys even wore little beads and ribbons. Whether this actually happened or is just one historian having too much fun imagining donkey fashion, scholars still argue, but you do spot a donkey nearby with a garland around its neck, munching happily on spilled grain while its owner shrugs in defeat. The novice walks toward the Temple of Vesta with the other Vestals. The line of women waiting for entry winds through the forum like a slow-moving river. Some carry infants, others hold baskets of offerings. A few clutch small clay figurines or charms meant for blessing. Their faces glow with excitement, reverence, and maybe just a bit of, I hope this line moves faster than last year. When the temple doors open, a hush falls, gentle but unmistakable. Women begin to enter, stepping softly, whispering prayers under their breath. The novice stands near the doorway, observing how calmly the senior Vestals guide visitors inside, accepting offerings, sprinkling blessed flour, and ensuring each woman has a moment to breathe in the peace of the sacred flame. The novice isn't allowed to assist yet, not with the public rituals, but she watches intently. Every movement matters. Every word is measured. The temple breathes with people's hopes. Families rely on these offerings for good fortune, for healthy children, for stable homes. It's easy to forget how much of Rome's world rested on the hearth. A household without fire was a household in peril. As she watches, a woman drops a tiny bowl of grain, clearly nervous. The novice's first instinct is to help, but she remembers she cannot intervene during this part of her training. So she steps back quietly, her hands twitching in sympathy. The older Vestal at the door gently reassures the visitor, offering a replacement bowl. No drama, no scolding, just the calm patience that defines this festival. Outside the temple, the forum buzzes with overlapping conversations. Children chase pigeons. Bakers hand out samples of newly baked bread. A merchant loudly advertises donkey-shaped pastries, which are either an offering or a snack, depending on how reverent you're feeling. You pass a group of musicians playing pipes and drums, their rhythm lively enough to get even the grumpiest senator tapping his foot. The novice's gaze wanders to a procession moving toward the temple. Women carry trays covered in white cloths, each bearing a sacred offering. They walk slowly, solemnly, like the rhythm of the ritual is guiding their feet. The novice unconsciously matches their pace, swaying slightly as though caught in the ceremony's gentle pull. A stray dog trots by with a wreath of flowers snagged around its neck, clearly having stolen it from somewhere. A child chases after it, shouting half-hearted threats, while the dog looks back with the smug confidence of someone who knows he's faster. Your light joke quota thanks him for his service. As the day unfolds, the novice is given a discreet task, grinding fresh grain using a shallow stone quern. She kneels beside the table, pouring a small scoop of barley onto the top stone, then pushing the handle in slow, circular motions. The grinding creates a soft, rhythmic rasp, blending into the festival's background music. Her sleeves brush lightly against the table edge. A dusting of flour coats her fingertips, making her feel unexpectedly grounded. A senior Vestal checks her progress, nods, and offers a small correction to her movement. The novice adjusts immediately. She's beginning to understand how ceremony and practicality intertwine, how something as simple as grinding grain becomes sacred through intention. Nearby, a group of Vestals prepares sacred cakes called liba, made with flour, water, and honey, then baked on hot stones. The scent is intoxicating, sweet, warm, nostalgic. You can almost taste the golden edges, crisp from the heat. As the sun drifts across the sky, the festival continues. Women leave the temple with peaceful expressions, clutching blessed flour or small tokens. Children pepper their mothers with questions. Merchants tally profits. Donkeys enjoy their annual moment of pampering. And through it all the flame burns, steady, vibrant, almost humming with joy. The novice stands at the temple steps, absorbing everything. The colours, the scents, the weight of tradition, the laughter of the crowd, the hush of prayers, the slow sweep of the sunlit forum. This is Rome at its most alive, and her place in it, quiet but powerful, is beginning to feel real. As evening approaches, the temple doors close once more. The women drift away, the merchants pack up, and the donkeys shake off their garlands with dramatic sighs. The novice walks back into the house of the Vestals, exhausted but glowing with the kind of tiredness that only comes from meaningful work. She has seen the city celebrate her goddess. She has watched the people of Rome place their faith in the rituals she's learning, and in the echo of fading festival sounds, she understands a little more of her purpose. The flame burns for Rome, but the festival reminds her, Rome burns for Vesta. You settle back into the rhythm of Rome as the novice Vestal returns from the festival, her steps slow but steady, like she's trying to stretch the last golden threads of the Vestalia through the quietening forum. The crowds have thinned, the donkeys have shed their garlands, and the city feels calmer, like a feast afterglow drifting over stone and dust. But inside the house of the Vestals, something different hums beneath the serene atmosphere. Not celebration, not ritual, privilege. Because even though the Vestals lived within strict rules, their lives were laced with freedoms and protections that most Roman women could only dream about. As you drift behind the novice, you sense her beginning to notice this shift too, the subtle way doors open for Vestals that stay shut for others. She starts the morning walking with two senior Vestals toward the forum, their veils neatly arranged, their robes immaculate. Rome treats them differently out here, and you can feel it the moment they step into public space. Vendors lower their voices, men step aside. Even the pigeons seem to give them more personal space, and pigeons are notoriously rude. One mainstream historical fact arrives with a warm glow. Vestal Virgins were among the only women in ancient Rome allowed to control their own property. At the end of their 30-year service, they could own land, manage wealth, even adopt children, a level of autonomy unheard of for most Roman women whose lives were usually tied to male guardians. The novice, though young, is already glimpsing this future possibility like a distant horizon. As the three Vestals move through the forum, the crowd parts, not out of fear, but respect. A man shouts angrily at a rival merchant, gesturing wildly with a handful of dates. But the moment he spots the Vestals, he lowers his voice, wipes his hands, and attempts a polite nod that accidentally sends a date flying. It bounces off a senator's sandal. The senator pretends not to notice. The novice hides a smile behind her veil. You feel her noticing other things too. People stare, but not with suspicion, with admiration, with gratitude, with that strange mix of reverence and superstition that Romans excel at. If a Vestal brushed against a condemned prisoner on their way to execution, the law said the prisoner had to be released. Accidentally brushing into someone could save a life. Imagine walking through a crowded city knowing your elbow is basically a divine pardon button. No pressure. A quirky tidbit bubbles up. Some ancient writers insisted that Vestals had front-row seats at gladiator games, not because they were bloodthirsty, but because their presence was believed to bring good fortune and fair outcomes. Scholars still argue whether they actually enjoyed the games or whether they secretly preferred quieter entertainment, like not watching people hit each other with tridents. The novice certainly seems unsure as she passes the amphitheatre, glancing at the noisy crowd like someone sidestepping a roller coaster they didn't sign up for. As the trio approaches the rostra, the speaker's platform where politicians shout dramatic things, something unexpected happens. A young man racing through the forum, probably late for work, possibly chased by his own to-do list, stumbles and nearly crashes into them. He stops short at the last second, breathless, eyes wide. If he'd collided, it could have been a serious offence. Harming a Vestal carried severe punishment. But instead of yelling or panicking, the senior Vestal places a calm hand over her chest and nods gently, signalling forgiveness. The man bows, face redder than a ripe pomegranate, and scurries away. You can almost hear him thinking, "Great, almost ran over the most important women in Rome. Fantastic morning so far." The novice absorbs all of this. The respect, the caution, the subtle power that comes not from force but from symbolism. For the first time, she realizes the paradox of her life. She is both protected and bound, revered yet restrained, sacred yet restricted. She cannot choose her path, but the path she's on commands authority in ways unimaginable to ordinary girls. As the Vestals continue walking, a magistrate approaches them, an older man with carefully trimmed beard and the weary expression of someone who's been reading legal scrolls since sunrise. He bows deeply and presents a sealed document for safekeeping. The Vestals often serve as guardians of wills, treaties, and sensitive state papers, precisely because they are trusted beyond reproach. The novice watches as the senior Vestal accepts the scroll with the dignified air of someone receiving a small puppy, not a state secret. Historians still argue whether this tradition emerged from genuine trust, or whether politicians simply needed someone outside the usual power struggles to hold important documents hostage. Either way, it worked. The novice recognizes that even her most mundane tasks ripple into politics and civic stability. On their way back to the atrium house, two children dart past, chasing each other with sticks. One stops abruptly upon spotting the Vestals, his eyes widening in awe. He whispers something to his friend, maybe a rumor that Vestals can call fire from the sky, or maybe just, "Don't run into them, or your mum will kill you." Kids in every era have their own mythology. Back inside the house of the Vestals, the novice retreats to the courtyard. She sits near the fountain and thinks, not with fear but contemplation. A senior Vestal sits beside her, braids gleaming like woven sunlight. "You've seen much today," she says softly. "Not all duties are performed in the temple." The novice nods slowly, absorbing the truth. Her life is bigger than sweeping the hearth or tending the flame. It extends into law, ceremony, public presence, and civic identity. To illustrate the point, the senior Vestal shares a final example. During emergencies, fires, earthquakes, sudden omens, the Vestals often acted as Rome's spiritual anchors. Their calmness, their purity, their sacred symbolism helped steady a panicking population. They were living embodiments of continuity. The novice sits back, feeling that gravity settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as purpose. She understands now that being a Vestal is not confinement. It's responsibility woven into privilege, privilege woven into service. As the sun dips lower, the city glows amber. Even from the quiet courtyard, you sense the respect Rome holds for these women. And as the novice closes her eyes, letting the fountain's gentle trickle lull her into stillness, you realize she's beginning to claim her place in this world. Not just as a trainee, but as someone Rome will soon look to in awe. You accompany the novice Vestal as she rises the next morning to a softer, more deliberate quiet than usual, a kind of hush that feels like the city itself is holding its breath. Today she'll witness something few novices see so early in their training, the Vestals participating in major public ceremonies. If the last section revealed their privileges, today reveals the weight of their visibility, how their presence ripples through Rome with political, spiritual, and emotional consequence. She adjusts her veil carefully, smoothing its edges with both hands. Her braids hang neatly beneath it, still fresh from the festival preparations of the previous day. A senior Vestal approaches, checking her appearance with the same precision one might use when assessing the alignment of a ritual altar. A nod. Approval granted. The novice exhales, shoulders relaxing by a fraction of an inch. They step out into the forum, sunlight spreading across the stone like warm honey. The city is already stirring, vendors setting out baskets of figs, soldiers clanking down the street in armor that's begging for a bit of oil. children tugging at their parents' tunics with early morning impatience. But as the Vestals appear, a subtle shift occurs. Voices lower. People straighten. Even the pigeons pause, as if suddenly aware that Rome is watching itself. One mainstream historical fact floats into your awareness. Vestals played a critical role in state rituals, especially those involving treaties, declarations of war, and purification of public spaces. When the city needed a divine stamp of approval, the Vestals were often present. Not as passive observers, but as spiritual guarantors. Their presence could legitimize political decisions, soothe fears, or remind Rome that its heart, symbolized by the sacred flame, still beat steadily. Today, they're headed toward a ceremony blessing a new treaty with a neighboring ally. Treaties in Rome weren't just signed, they were sanctified, often involving oaths, sacrifices, and symbolic gestures that made lawyers look like amateurs. As the Vestals approach, people shift aside to give them space. The novice walks carefully, matching the senior Vestal's measured pace. She feels the eyes on her, and you sense her trying not to trip over absolutely nothing, which, let's be honest, is something any of us would worry about. Near the rostra, a small crowd has gathered. Senators in pristine togas stand around a carved altar, where a priest prepares a sacrifice. Don't worry, we're keeping it PG-13, so you get the incense and symbolism without any gore. The air smells of myrtle smoke and something slightly peppery, perhaps crushed laurel. A gentle breeze pushes the scent through the crowd, wrapping the scene in a warm, almost drowsy fog. The Vestals take their places along the side of the platform. They don't speak. They don't gesture grandly. They simply stand, veiled, serene, unshakably calm. And yet, their presence is louder than any speech delivered today. The novice feels it too. Her posture straightens. Her fingers unfold from the nervous curl she didn't realize she'd shaped them into. She glances at the flame-shaped embroidery along the trim of the senior Vestal's robe, drawing courage from it. The ceremony begins. A senator reads the terms of the treaty aloud, his voice rising and falling with practiced dignity. The words roll over the forum like slow waves. The Vestals remain motionless, each a pillar of ritual gravity. When the reading ends, the priest lifts a bowl of salted meal. The senior Vestal steps forward and pinches a small handful, sprinkling it over the altar. The grains fall like pale snow, catching sunlight as they drift. This is the symbolic blessing Rome expects, a gesture so small it could vanish in an instant, yet enormous in meaning. The novice watches intently, memorizing every movement, the angle of the wrist, the controlled breath, the way the grains scatter evenly. Later, she'll practice this motion dozens of times, learning how something seemingly simple is actually a tiny ritual dance perfected over centuries. As the ceremony continues, you notice the crowd studying the Vestals with near reverence. A visiting foreign dignitary leans toward his advisor, whispering something with awe in his expression. You can almost hear him thinking, these women hold Rome's fate in their fingertips, and honestly, he's not wrong. A quirky tidbit dances through your mind. Some ancient writers claim that during certain public rites, if a Vestal accidentally tripped or her veil slipped, it was considered an omen, often a bad one. Scholars still argue whether this was genuine religious belief or just another case of Romans being a little too dramatic about everything. Either way, the novice is very aware of her own feet right now. After the formal blessing, the Vestals accompany the procession toward the Capitoline Hill. Along the way, the novice catches moments she'll remember her whole life. Children waving tiny wreaths, women holding their infants a little tighter as the Vestals pass, hoping for spiritual good fortune. A group of older men stepping back respectfully, their hands pressed to their chests. The novice feels the weight of her presence in every gesture. At the foot of the Capitoline, the air grows cooler. A small ritual follows. Simple, quiet. The senior Vestal touches the base of a ceremonial spear with a sprig of sacred laurel. The act symbolizes protection, peace, and divine oversight. She then steps back, her movements fluid as flowing water. The novice watches the ritual from just behind her. Her heart thumps in her chest, steady but imbued with awe. You sense her thinking, one day I'll do this. One day I'll stand where she stands now. and for a moment you see not the nervous child who first stepped through the Vestal's doorway, but the silhouette of the woman she will become, calm, powerful, woven into the fabric of Rome. As the procession winds down the hill, a light joke moment finds you. A senator accidentally steps on the hem of his own toga and nearly performs a very undignified dance move. The novice notices, quickly averting her gaze, but the twitch of her veil suggests she's fighting a smile. Back inside the house of the Vestals, the novice finally exhales. She sits near the fountain, dipping her fingers into the cool water. The ripples distort her reflection, but not her growing understanding. She now knows firsthand that public ceremony is not about spectacle. It's about presence, symbolism, and steadiness under watchful eyes. The flame she tends inside the temple symbolizes Rome's survival, but the presence she maintains outside the temple symbolizes Rome's confidence. And as she leans her head back, letting the last glimmers of sunlight warm her braids, she feels a quiet truth settle into her bones. Being a Vestal isn't just ritual. It's responsibility lived out in every step, every gaze, every breath. You follow the novice Vestal into an unusually still afternoon, the kind of quiet that settles over Rome when the heat presses everyone indoors and even the pigeons look like they're reconsidering their life choices. But inside the house of the Vestals, a different kind of tension hums beneath the calm. It's subtle at first, whispers in the hallway, averted eyes, the quick patter of sandals against stone. The novice feels it before she understands it. Something is wrong, and today she will learn why the Vestal vow carries not just honour, but unimaginable risk. A senior Vestal summons her to a small chamber near the back of the complex. The room is dim, its only light drawn in thin strands from a high window. Here, the walls feel heavier, as if they've heard secrets they'd rather not repeat. The senior Vestal doesn't smile. She gestures for the novice to sit. "You must understand," she says softly, "we serve Rome, but Rome does not always serve gently in return." The novice sits straighter. Her hands fold neatly in her lap. You sense her bracing, though she doesn't know for what. The senior begins with a truth the novice has heard whispered, but never explained in full. Breaking the Vestal vow, especially the vow of chastity, was considered an act not merely of personal failing, but of treason. A mainstream historical fact hits with a soft thud. The Romans believed the purity of the Vestals was directly tied to the purity and fortune of the state. If a Vestal was found unclean, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a cosmic misalignment, an omen that threatened the stability of Rome itself. The novice swallows. She's heard the myths. The cautionary tales told in gentle tones late at night, stories that make apprentices pull their robes tighter around their shoulders. But myths are soft around the edges. Reality is sharp. The senior Vestal continues with the gravity of someone who has carried this knowledge for decades. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, she would be tried, not by a court of peers, not by the public, but by the Pontifex Maximus himself, the highest priest in Rome. And his judgment was final. No appeal, no debate, no second chances. You feel the novice's breath hitch. Then comes the punishment, described with quiet, unwavering clarity. The condemned Vestal was led to a small underground chamber near the city gate. Because harming or killing a Vestal directly was forbidden, sacred bodies required sacred loopholes, the Romans constructed an elaborate fiction. They would not execute her, they insisted. They would simply place her somewhere where she might descend to the earth, with a bit of food, water, oil, and a lamp. What happened after that was between her and fate. You sense the chill crawl up the novice's spine. A quirky tidbit rushes in to break the tension for a heartbeat. Some ancient writers claim the underground chamber was furnished with a tiny couch and a lamp, as if someone decided, if we're doing this terrible thing, at least let's make it minimally homey. Scholars still argue whether this detail reflects ritual symbolism, or simply a writer trying to soften the horror with uncomfortable interior decor commentary. The novice lowers her gaze, absorbing the weight of what she's become part of. This isn't fear for herself, not yet. It's fear for the women who came before her, whose stories still echo through the halls like faint footsteps. The senior Vestal tells one such story. A Vestal named Claudia, accused unjustly, according to some sources, of impurity. When her accusers questioned her virtue, She prayed to the goddess and in a dramatic moment worthy of a stage play, pulled a ship's rope to free a vessel stuck along the Tiber's bank. The miracle proved her innocence, or so said those who believed her. Historians still argue whether this actually happened or whether the tale was later propaganda to defend the Vestal's reputation. Another story is even darker. A Vestal condemned after ominous prodigies struck the city, despite her protests of innocence. Rome was a place where a lightning strike, a failed harvest, or a two-headed calf could send everyone scrambling for scapegoats. And Vestals, holding such symbolic power, were easy targets when people needed someone to blame. You follow the novice as she rises slowly, her mind heavy but clearer. The senior Vestal guides her outside, where a soft breeze cuts through the tension. They walk the perimeter of the courtyard in silence, each step echoing the fragility of duty. Finally, the senior stops near a statue, a serene figure draped in calm stone robes. "Remember," she whispers, "our vow is not only a burden, it is also our greatest armour." The novice frowns slightly, unsure. The senior elaborates. Vestals were legally protected. Any person who harmed them faced severe punishment. They had the right to own property, make wills, and live independently, privileges few Roman women had. If they walked through the streets, crowds parted. If they touched a prisoner heading to execution by accident, the law demanded he be freed. They shared Rome's deepest dangers, but also its highest honours. You sense the novice's heart steadying, her breath slowing. Fear reshapes itself into resolve. One of the older Vestals joins them, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft linen. She reveals an ancient tablet inscribed with laws relating to the Vestals. The novice traces the carved letters with reverent fingers. She recognizes now that her life is woven into a tapestry of protection and peril, where each thread, privilege, duty, ritual, punishment, holds equal weight. As the three women stand quietly, sunlight filters through the archway, catching dust motes in a lazy golden dance. The moment softens. It's not about fear anymore, it's about responsibility. Massive, yes, but also meaningful. The novice inhales deeply, letting the air fill her lungs with the certainty that she must guard not just the flame, but her own integrity. To lighten the air, fate sends a small joke your way. A pigeon nearby hops indignantly as if it overheard the conversation and would like to lodge a complaint about Rome's general attitude toward omens. The novice glances at it and laughs softly, a tiny bubble of relief in a day heavy with lessons. By the time she returns to the inner courtyard, the shadows have lengthened, and the fountain glimmers with late sunlight. She sits beside it, letting her fingers trail through the cool water. The ripples distort her reflection, not erasing it, just shifting it, reminding her that she is still changing, still learning. She understands now. The Vestal life is not simply ritual and reverence, it is trust. Fragile, sacred, powerful trust. Trust Rome gives. Trust Rome demands. Trust she must protect every day. As evening settles over the sanctuary, the novice rises steadier than before. She walks toward the temple, toward the flame, toward the vows she now understands not just in words, but in consequence. You slip behind the novice Vestal as she steps out into the cool evening air, her sandals making soft taps on the marble floor. Tonight feels different. Not solemn, not heavy, but strangely electric. The sun is settling behind Rome's rooftops, leaving streaks of pink and gold that vanish as quickly as gossip in the Senate. The senior Vestals have called the novices together for something special. Not a warning, not a ceremony, not a lecture, a story circle. The Vestals, though guardians of fire and purity, are also guardians of legend. And tonight, the novice will hear tales that shimmer along the line between history and miracle. Stories whispered for centuries, some inspiring, some unsettling, some told just often enough to keep young Vestals alert and, ideally, in line. They gather in the courtyard. Lamps glow. Softly, their flames dancing like tiny echoes of Vesta's eternal fire. The fountain murmurs gently as though itching to eavesdrop. A senior Vestal sits on a low bench, smoothing her robes. Her posture is immaculate, her expression serene, but her voice carries a hint of theatrical mischief, as all good storytellers do. "The flame is not the only wonder in our history," she begins. "We have carried miracles, And sometimes, miracles have carried us. The novices lean in, you lean in. Even the stray cat that sneaks into the atrium house for warmth decides this is worth listening to. The first tale is of Amelia, a Vestal whose name radiates through Roman legend like the glow of a hearth. One mainstream historical fact grounds the story. Amelia was accused of carelessness when the sacred flame went out on her watch, an offence that could have been catastrophic. But legend claims that instead of punishment, she reached out her veil and ignited the fire anew with nothing but a prayer and the fabric's touch. A miracle, a divine defence, a phoenix moment engineered by faith. The novices whisper in awe. The senior Vestal raises an eyebrow ever so slightly as if to say, yes, yes, a good story, but don't go tossing your veil at the flame and expecting divine kindling. You notice the novice glancing toward the temple, perhaps wondering whether her own veil has hidden ignition abilities. You resist the urge to tell her not to test that theory unless she wants to spend a week sweeping ash. The senior continues with another story. This one stranger, more atmospheric. A Vestal once dropped a sacred object into the Tiber, a disaster by ritual standards. But rather than panic, she walked to the riverbank, prayed, and waited. The current shifted. The object floated to the surface and drifted gently into her hands, as though the river itself bowed to her devotion. A quirky tidbit slips in. Some versions of this legend insist that a fish helped push the object to shore. Was it a sacred fish? A well-trained fish? A fish having a particularly helpful afternoon? Historians still argue whether this was poetic symbolism or someone in ancient Rome simply wanted more animals in their miracle stories. Considering this is the same civilization that gave us she-wolf myths and omens based on chicken behaviour, you wouldn't be surprised. A breeze brushes through the courtyard, flickering the lamp flames. Shadows ripple across the marble tiles. The novice pulls her robe tighter as the senior Vestal begins the third tale, one heavier than the others. It is the story of Tuccia, a Vestal accused of impurity. Instead of protesting endlessly, she called on Vesta to judge her virtue. She took a sieve, one riddled with holes, and walked to the Tiber. According to legend, she scooped water into it, and carried it all the way back to the temple without spilling a drop. A miracle woven from faith and defiance. The novices stare, wide-eyed. You half expect one, of them to whisper, "We have sieves?" Because honestly, that detail would pique anyone's curiosity after the vault tour. The senior Vestal smiles softly, acknowledging the drama of the tale without outright declaring it factual. In truth, scholars still argue whether Tuccia's story was an act of divine intervention, political theatre, or a metaphor blown out of proportion by a poet who really liked kitchen tools. But the point stands. Vestals, in Rome's imagination, were women of impossible capability. Then comes a shift in tone. The senior Vestal's voice softens, not weakened, but deepened. She tells the novices that miracles, whether literal or symbolic, represent the power Rome wanted the Vestals to embody, but they are not promises, and certainly not guarantees. We are human, she reminds them. Our strength comes from devotion, not magic. The novice absorbs the words, her brow furrowed in thought. She seems to understand now. The legends are both inspiration and caution. They set the bar high, but they also remind her that Vestals live inside stories bigger than themselves, stories they must honour without becoming reckless with their faith. A light joke breezes through the moment when another novice, clearly lost in wonder, accidentally knocks over a small pot with her robe. The clang echoes embarrassingly. The senior Vestal lifts a brow, pauses her story and says with a dry tone, "Let's hope the river carries that back as well." Laughter ripples gently through the courtyard, but then the senior shifts to a story that unsettles even her calm demeanour. "Not all miracles are gentle," she begins. The novices lean in again, hands clasped. She speaks of Rome's darkest omens, earthquakes, plagues, eclipses, times when fear curled around the city like smoke. In those moments, the Vestals were said to stand before the sacred flame and pray so fiercely that the fire rose higher, defying wind and storm. Some witnesses swore the flame roared like a living creature, answering their devotion. Others insisted it grew cold, burning blue like a ghostly torch. Historians still argue whether these accounts were symbolic exaggerations, political manipulations, or simple misunderstanding. But as you watch the novices' faces, it's clear the stories hold emotional truth even if the literal details blur across centuries. The novice glances toward the temple, toward that flame she's learning to shape her life around. You can almost feel her wondering whether she could ever stand as firmly as these legendary women did, whether she could face a city in crisis and not flinch. The senior Vestal ends with the gentlest miracle of all, a story of a Vestal who calmed a panicked crowd during a fire in the Forum simply by walking forward and lifting her hands. No spell, no divine lightning, just presence, just faith, just the quiet authority of a woman who knew that Rome expected steadiness from her and chose to give it. The novices sit in silence, letting the stories settle into their bones. You feel something settle into yours too, a warmth, a sense of timelessness, a recognition that legends shape us even when we know they're embellished. Finally, the senior dismisses them for the night. The novice lingers a moment beside the fountain, watching the ripples shimmer beneath the moonlight. Her expression is thoughtful, humbled, inspired. She's beginning to understand that being a Vestal isn't just about rules or rituals, it's about perception, expectation, symbolism. The city believes in their power, and belief is its own kind of magic. As she rises, adjusting her veil, she whispers a small prayer, not for miracles but for strength, and somewhere in the temple the flame flickers, as if listening. You trail the novice Vestal the next morning as she steps into a world that looks exactly the same as yesterday. Same cobbled streets, same bustling forum, same pigeons plotting mischief on the rooftops, but feels entirely different. Yesterday was miracles and legends, whispered stories that glowed warmly in the dark. Today is politics, and Rome does politics the way Rome does everything, loudly, theatrically, and with enough scheming to fuel 10 seasons of a prestige drama. It begins subtly. The senior Vestals gather the novices not for ritual training, not for chores, but for observation. You must understand, one says, folding her hands with careful calm, that our purity is not just a religious vow. It is a tool Rome uses, sometimes wisely, sometimes not. The novice frowns. She's still new enough to think politics is something senators do while yelling on steps. But she's about to learn that the Vestals, quiet, sacred, disciplined, stand right in the middle of Rome's political spiderweb, whether they want to or not. They step into the forum, and immediately you feel the atmosphere buzz with tension. A group of senators stands in a tight knot, whispering fiercely. Their brows are knitted so tightly you could grate cheese on them. A magistrate hurries past, scrolls tucked under his arm, muttering to himself. A pair of orators warm up their voices like actors backstage. The Vestals are here for a public ritual of thanksgiving, simple enough on the surface. But beneath it, currents pull. You follow the novice's gaze as she notices how the senators straighten their posture when the Vestals appear. Respect? Yes. Reverence? Sure. But also calculation. Political minds see not just women in sacred robes, they see opportunity. A mainstream historical fact slips into place. Roman leaders often invoked the Vestals to legitimize their actions. If a dictator wanted to reassure the public after a controversial decision, guess who he'd stage near during a ceremony? Vestals. If a general wanted to give divine polish to a military victory, whose blessing would be highlighted? Vestals. Their presence was a stamp of cosmic approval. The novice senses it too, even if she doesn't understand it yet. Her skin prickles under the weight of those gazes, respectful. Yes, but heavy. Loaded. As the ceremony begins, a senator delivers a speech thanking the gods for a recent diplomatic success. He gestures broadly, too broadly, and his toga nearly slips off one shoulder. You suspect this man practices his speeches more than he practices wearing clothes. But as he speaks, he keeps turning slightly toward the Vestals, positioning himself near them like a tourist trying to get the perfect backdrop. The novice tilts her head, realizing he's using their presence like a prop. The senior Vestal notices too and exhales through her nose, the universal sign for, "I am deeply too old for this nonsense." Her veil doesn't move, but you can almost imagine the eye roll happening beneath it. Rome's political game is complicated, and the Vestal's role in it is even more so. Another quirky tidbit threads its way into the moment. Some ancient writers claim that during heated political disputes, opponents would try to recruit Vestals, not to speak but to appear at certain events. Just standing next to the right faction could sway public opinion. Scholars still argue whether this was formal influence or simply social manipulation dressed up in divine respect. Midway through the ceremony, the novice notices something odd near the edge of the crowd. Two politicians, one red-faced with anger, the other with the smug look of someone who definitely started the argument, are debating fiercely about the correct interpretation of an omen involving a flock of geese. Yes, geese. Rome took omens seriously, and by seriously you mean so seriously it sometimes bordered on poultry-based drama. One politician glances toward the Vestals, trying to gauge whether their presence leans in his favour. Another tries to position himself closer to them, like he's hoping divine approval works by proximity. The novice watches this ridiculous shuffle with wide eyes. A senior Vestal leans down and murmurs, "We are not prizes to be won." It's soft but sharp, like silk wrapped around steel. As the ceremony moves into the offering phase, the novice helps carry a small bowl of incense. Her hands are steady, though her mind churns. She sees now how the Vestals resemble the sacred flame, illuminating the city, yes, but also vulnerable to the winds of politics that swirl around them. A procession begins toward the Temple of Concord. Senators walk in stiff lines. Priests swing censers. Musicians play pipes that squeak a little too enthusiastically. And as always, the Vestals walk in calm, measured steps, anchors in the sea of political posturing. Along the route, the novice hears snippets of conversation. If the Vestals bless the treaty, the people will accept. She stood near him during the last ritual. That must mean, imagine if a Vestal testified in his favour. The senior Vestals pretend not to hear. This too is part of their vow. Historians still argue whether the Vestals ever directly involved themselves in politics, or whether their perceived involvement was just projection by powerful men eager to borrow their credibility. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Vestals weren't political pawns, but they weren't fully insulated either. Influence seeps, even through sacred walls. Halfway up the slope to the temple, a senator stops suddenly, blocking the path as he makes an exaggerated gesture in the Vestals' direction. A symbolic plea for divine oversight, or so he says. The senior Vestal glides past without pausing, her expression unchanged. The novice mirrors her carefully. They aren't here to endorse anyone. Their neutrality is their shield. Still, the moment sparks a debate among the watching crowd. One woman whispers that the Vestal's movement signalled approval. Another argues it meant disapproval. A man near them shrugs and says, "I think she was just trying not to trip," which, let's be honest, is probably the most accurate interpretation. By the time the ritual concludes, the novice is exhausted, not physically, but mentally. She saw how fiercely Rome tries to pull the Vestals into its power struggles, how their mere presence can shift moods and meanings, and she understands, finally, why the seniors emphasize calm, neutrality, and emotional stillness. A Vestal who reacts too visibly could inadvertently change political winds. Back in the house of the Vestals, the novice sinks onto a bench near the fountain. The water glimmers in soft afternoon light, soothing her like a whispered lullaby. She dips her fingers into the cool surface, grounding herself. One senior Vestal sits beside her. "You saw how they look at us," she murmurs. The novice nods. "They see symbols," the elder continues. "Not women." A pause. The fountain bubbles gently. "But we are women," the senior adds softly, "and symbols. We walk between roles. We must not let either one consume us." The novice absorbs this, letting the wisdom settle like warm ash. Outside, the rumble of political debate grows distant. Inside, the flame still burns, steady, unmarred by the chaos beyond, and the novice realizes that her life will always sit at this crossroads, part sacred, part political, part visible, part invisible, a guardian of fire, and a woman Rome will forever attempt to interpret. You follow the novice Vestal as she returns to the quieter quarters of the atrium house, her mind still buzzing from the political currents she witnessed earlier. She's barely had time to sit down before another senior Vestal beckons her, this time to something far less grand, far less public, and far more fiddly. The kinds of tasks that fill the long hours between ceremonies, the odd jobs, the practical tools, the behind-the-scenes magic that keeps the Temple of Vesta from collapsing into ritual chaos. She steps into a long, sunlit room filled with tables, shelves, baskets, and jars. At first glance, it looks like an ancient craft workshop. At second glance, it still looks like a craft workshop, but with a faint aura of holiness that clings to everything like dust motes in sunbeams. The senior Vestal gestures toward a wooden table crowded with objects. Brooms with twig bristles, bronze ladles, bone pins, coiled cords dyed red, tiny clay seals, and several items whose purpose is not immediately apparent. Some look like kitchen tools. Some look like archaeological mysteries. Some look like the kind of things you find in a junk drawer and keep just in case. These, the senior says, are our tools. The novice steps closer, eyebrows raised. She expected fire hooks and incense bowls. She did not expect a chest full of oddly shaped spoons, or a pile of smooth stones, or a wicker basket that looks exactly like something you'd take on a picnic. The senior picks up the basket first. This, she says, is for carrying sacred offerings, grain, flour, incense, or on festival days, cakes. The novice suppresses a smile at the memory of donkey-shaped pastries. Next, the senior lifts a long-handled bronze spoon with a flat oval bowl. And this, she continues, is a simpulum. We use it for pouring libations during purification rites. A mainstream historical fact echoes gently in your ear. The simpulum was a standard Roman priestly tool, often seen in carvings and temple reliefs. The Vestals used it frequently, more often than most other priestly orders, because Vesta's rituals involve so many offerings of wine, milk, water, and sacred mixtures. The novice nods with serious solemnity, though you sense she's wondering why every ancient tool is so dramatically heavy. The senior continues her tour, lifting each object like a relic of mythical importance. A set of small bronze chisels for engraving seals, a shallow stone bowl for grinding herbs, a spindle and wool for repairing veils, a series of cords knotted in sequences that correspond to ritual days, a kind of calendar meets abacus situation. A quirky tidbit pops in. According to some ancient writers, the Vestals kept a sacred dung scoop. Yes, really, because donkey dung was sometimes burned in very specific purification rites. Whether this was literal or a poet's attempt at humour is something historians still argue, but you do spot a metal scoop sitting innocently on a shelf and decide not to ask questions. The novice listens, wide-eyed, as the senior hands her a broom made of thin, fresh twigs bound with wool. "You will use this for the hearth," she says. "Never a broom with burnt bristles, fresh twigs only. Vesta prefers new beginnings." The novice takes the broom reverently, though you're pretty sure part of her brain is thinking, great. Even sweeping has rules. She's then guided to a small alcove containing clay tablets with neat marks pressed into their surfaces. At first glance, they look like decorative tiles, but the senior explains they are ancient tally records, inventories of grain, incense, oil, and ritual tools. Some are centuries old, preserved because the Vestals believed continuity was sacred. The novice runs her finger over one of the indents, tracing it like a faint echo of a sister from long ago. She can almost feel the movement of hands from generations past smoothing the same clay. The senior Vestal then leads her to a niche with shelves of candles, long thick tallow candles that smell faintly of honey. "We use these only at night when tending the flame," she explains, "never for ordinary lighting, and never as substitutes for the sacred fire." The novice nods, absorbing everything. The rules around the tools seem endless, but she sees now how each one grounds the rituals with practicality. Even sacred duties require a toolkit. Then the senior hands her something unexpected, a tiny bronze bell. "For ceremonies requiring silence," she says, "when sound is forbidden, but attention is required." The novice tilts her head, confused. The senior explains, certain purification rites demand absolute quiet, but when a new step begins, or a prayer must be synchronized, the gentle tap of the bell provides coordination without breaking the vow of silence. Historians still argue whether this bell was used widely or only during specific centuries, but the one the novice holds feels old, older than the Republic, older than the stones under her feet. Next comes a strange-looking object, an elegantly carved wooden paddle with slits running through it. The novice frowns. "This," the senior says, "is for sifting grain during offerings. Watch." She pours a handful of barley onto the paddle, shaking it lightly so that dust and chaff fall through the slits, leaving clean grain behind. The movement is fluid, almost hypnotic. The novice tries, and immediately half her barley lands on her sandals. The senior smiles, softly, patiently, and hands her another handful. As she practices, a gentle joke moment sneaks in. A pigeon lurks near the doorway, eyes locked on the spilled grain like a furry little opportunist. The novice tries to nudge it away with her foot, but it simply hops to the other side of her sandal, giving her a look that says, "I was here first." The senior chuckles. He visits daily. We call him Lucius. The novice laughs, tension easing. They move on to fabric work. The senior shows her how to mend ritual veils with small bone needles. Each stitch must be even and nearly invisible. The novice pricks her finger on the first try. She doesn't cry out, but she winces, shaking her hand. The senior nods approvingly at her silence, offers a small cloth and says, "Even the goddess understands first attempts." Next comes the strangest job of the day, preparing clay seals. The Vestals often sealed sacred containers, grain jars, storage chests, even temple doors, with clay impressions bearing the mark of Vesta's symbol. The novice is handed a small stamp carved with a flame motif. She presses it into warm clay, watching the symbol emerge crisp and sharp. She smiles. This part she likes. The senior explains that sealing isn't just practical, it's symbolic. Breaking a seal carelessly is considered a breach of ritual order. Keeping the temple organized is part of keeping Rome spiritually balanced. The novice continues practicing until her hands are covered with faint dust and clay. She wipes them on her apron, leaving streaks of pale brown, and feels oddly proud of the mess. One last tool catches her attention, a smooth stone sphere about the size of a fist. When she picks it up, she's surprised by the weight. It warms the hands in winter, the senior says. Heat it by the hearth, then hold it during long ceremonies. Sacred work is easier when your fingers can move. The novice clutches it and nods. It's simple, practical, comforting. By the end of the session, she's swept, sealed, stitched, sifted, ladled, ground herbs, and chased Lucius the pigeon 3 separate times. Her arms ache, her fingers are dusty, her braids are slightly crooked, but she feels grounded. These odd tasks, these quiet tools, form the heartbeat of her service. They connect her to the thousands of small gestures that keep the sacred flame alive, the rituals running smoothly, the temple's order intact. Not every duty is dramatic, not every task is public, but each one, carried out with intention, adds another layer of devotion to the life she's building. And as she kneels to return the broom to its hook, she smiles softly. A real, unguarded smile. Because she's beginning to understand that sacredness isn't only in miracles or ceremonies. It's in the humble, daily work that binds everything together. You slip back into the rhythm of the sanctuary, just as the novice Vestal finishes her morning duties, sweeping the hearth, arranging herbs, checking the incense stores, and attempting, for the 3rd time, to keep Lucius the pigeon from turning the courtyard into his personal buffet. She's growing into the role now, her steps steadier, her hands more confident. But today she's preoccupied, quiet, thoughtful, because today she'll witness something rarely spoken of in detail. What happens after the 30-year vow? For all the public awe surrounding Vestals, people tend to forget that their lives don't end when their service does. There is an after, a long, winding, often surprising after, and the senior Vestals are determined to teach her that the oath, though binding for decades, is not a cage for life. The morning begins with a soft knock at the sanctuary gate. When it opens, a woman enters, dignified, stately, and dressed in fine wool dyed the deep plum colour worn by Roman matrons of high status. Her hair flows freely down her back instead of being braided into ritual coils. Her face holds lines that speak of laughter and storms, someone who has seen Rome from angles few citizens ever glimpse. The novice stares. Is this? Yes, a former Vestal, retired, respected, free. She carries herself like someone who has never known fear in the Forum, whose steps have carved their own space in the city. The senior Vestals greet her warmly, embracing her with sisterly affection. She returns their smiles, then turns her gaze toward the novices. Her eyes soften. "I remember being where you are," she says, voice warm with nostalgia. Hands trembling every time the flame sparked. Afraid to sneeze near a sacred bowl, she winks. "You'll grow out of it." The novices laugh quietly, the tension easing like fabric unclenched. The visitor, once known as Terentia but now simply Terentia the Free settles onto a bench in the courtyard. The fountain behind her murmurs approvingly, as if welcoming back an old friend. The novices gather around her, and the senior Vestal steps aside, letting the lesson unfold. "One thing you must understand," Terentia says, smoothing her mantle, "is that the end of service is not the end of purpose." A mainstream historical fact drifts to you. Retired Vestals were granted remarkable independence. They could own property, manage finances, adopt children, and even marry if they chose. No male guardian had authority over them, not father, not brother, not husband. In a world where most women's lives were tightly controlled, retired Vestals lived with astonishing autonomy. The novice's eyes widen as she hears this. She's known the vow is long, 30 years, but now she sees its other half, its reward. Terentia continues, describing how odd it felt at first to walk Rome's streets without a veil marking her as sacred. "It took me a month to stop expecting everyone to bow," she admits, smirking. "One vendor actually chased me down because I walked away without paying. Habit, you see. Vestals never carry coins." The novices laugh again. Even the senior Vestal cracks a tiny smile. "Did you marry?" one of the younger novices asks, then blushes, realizing the question might be too bold. Terentia doesn't mind. "No," she answers, "but some do. Some want families, some adopt, some prefer their own company. The choice is ours alone. It's the first choice we get to make freely in decades." Historians still argue whether retired Vestals had difficulty adjusting to marriage or social life after such long seclusion. Some sources insist men were afraid to marry them, believing they carried an air of divine unpredictability. Others claim Vestals made excellent wives because they were disciplined and intelligent. Terentia waves a hand dismissively at those debates. "People speculate about us because they can't imagine women making their own choices," she says dryly. The novice glances down at her hands. Choices? She hasn't thought of that word in a while. Terentia stands, stretching her arms. "Come," she says, "walk with me." They stroll through the atrium, and she points out little details the novices overlook every day. The places where older Vestals carved initials into stone benches, the worn patch on a column where generations of nervous hands brushed before major rituals, the gap in the tile mosaic where a clumsy apprentice dropped a brazier centuries ago. She stops near a shelf holding clay seals, the ones the novice learned to make yesterday. Picking one up, she smiles. "We all made these, thousands of them. When I see one in the market now, stamped onto a jar, I feel a strange fondness. A life I lived, but don't live anymore." The novice listens intently. This is a glimpse into a future she has never imagined. A future where she isn't just a symbol, but a person. Terentia leads them back to the courtyard. "When your service ends," she says, voice softening, "you will be honoured with a procession, gifts, a pension, sometimes even a house. The city shows gratitude to those who kept its heart alive for so long." A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some retired Vestals became matchmakers, using their respected status to negotiate marriages in elite families. Others became patrons of the arts or mentors to young women seeking education, rare work in Rome's male-centered society. A few, according to rumor, even advised politicians discreetly. Whether that's true or just dramatic storytelling, historians still argue. The novice perks up when Terentia mentions travel. "I visited Ostia," she says proudly, "and once even Capri. Do you know how many ordinary Roman women get to see the sea on their own terms? Very few, but a free Vestal can go where she wishes." The novices murmur, impressed. Then Terentia's expression turns tender. "But you must also understand this. When the vow ends, you may feel unmoored. You've been part of something grand, something larger than yourself. Leaving it is a kind of grief." The fountain trickles softly. The courtyard feels almost like it's listening. "I cried the first night," Terentia admits, "not from sadness alone, but from the weight of freedom. After 30 years of every moment shaped by duty, silence feels like a new universe." The novice imagines it, a life where she chooses her own clothes, her own meals, her own hours, a life without the eternal flame whispering in her ears every morning. The thought is both thrilling and frightening. Terentia reaches out and takes her hand. "You will not be alone," she assures her. "Rome remembers its Vestals, and the sisterhood, It stays with you always. A small, light-hearted moment follows when Lucius the pigeon swoops dramatically onto Terentia's shoulder, as if making a bold statement about his own retirement benefits. The novices gasp. Terentia laughs and feeds him a grain she just happened to have in her palm. Finally, as the sun begins to dip, she prepares to leave. She kisses the senior Vestal's cheek, nods respectfully to the novices, and steps back toward the gate. No veil, no guards, no formal procession. Just a woman, free, whole, unafraid. The novice watches her go, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of longing and purpose. She understands, clearer than ever, that the life she's building is not an endless tunnel. It's a road with a distant horizon, a long journey of service, followed by a long life of choice. And as the gate closes, the flame inside the temple flickers, its light dancing softly across the girl's thoughtful expression. She turns back toward her duties, feeling the weight of her vow and the promise of the life waiting beyond it. You drift alongside the novice Vestal as she wakes the next morning to an atmosphere that feels unusually expectant, like the sanctuary is holding a quiet breath. Today's lesson isn't about tools or rituals or politics. It's about people. Specifically, the women whose names echo louder than the rest, whose lives became stories, whose choices shaped the reputation of the entire order. Today the novice will meet, not literally, but through memory, the famous Vestals, the ones whose legacies shimmer through Roman history like threads of gold woven into white wool. The senior Vestals gather the novices in the lecture room, a calm space near the library where light slices through high windows in long warm beams. Dust motes swirl lazily in the glow, scrolls line the shelves like quiet witnesses. The air smells faintly of papyrus and lavender oil. The senior Vestal, Lentidia, a woman with silver-flecked braids and a voice as smooth as worn marble, begins by unrolling a scroll. Today, she says gently, you will hear the names of your sisters from centuries past. Some rose to honour, some fell to tragedy, all shaped the path you now walk. The novices exchange glances, leaning in eagerly. Lentidia starts with Amelia, the same Amelia whose miracle veil tending the novice heard about earlier in the courtyard. But now the tale gains depth. She wasn't just the Vestal who revived the flame, Lentidia explains. She was a woman known for integrity. The city trusted her so deeply that even disputes between senators were brought to her for arbitration. A mainstream historical fact settles into the room. Many Vestals served as trusted neutral witnesses in state matters, precisely because their reputation for honesty was unparalleled. Amelia embodied that ideal. The novice listens with wide eyes, imagining herself one day being trusted with such responsibility. Next comes Tuccia, the famed water-bearing miracle worker who carried river water in a sieve. Lentidia describes her calmly. She was bold, she says, and brilliant. Perhaps too brilliant for those who feared powerful women. The novices shift subtly, understanding the implication. Rome did not always treat exceptional women kindly. Historians still argue whether Tuccia's story was literal truth, symbolic defense, or clever courtroom theatre. Lentidia acknowledges this with a knowing tilt of her head. Miracle or metaphor, she says. Tuccia's courage is real. Then Lentidia's voice deepens as she unveils a more tragic name, Cornelia. A Vestal executed under suspicion of impurity. Some say unjustly, others say the evidence was real. The senior Vestal describes how Cornelia walked to her burial calmly, refusing to let fear crack her dignity. Her last words, Lentidia says quietly, were, "I have loved truth and lived it." The novices fall silent. Even you feel the weight of those words settle over your shoulders like a heavy cloak. A quirky tidbit flutters in to soften the moment. Some ancient playwrights claimed Cornelia's ghost haunted the forum for decades, appearing at night to scold corrupt politicians. Whether Rome actually had a spectral Vestal problem or playwrights were simply doing what playwrights do, adding dramatic seasoning, remains a scholarly debate. Lentidia includes this tidbit with a smirk, and the novices exhale a soft laugh. Then the lesson shifts again, this time toward Claudia Quinta, whose legend sparkles with theatrical flair. Lentidia describes the crisis, a sacred statue becoming stuck while being transported up the Tiber. Whispers arose that Rome had lost divine favour. Claudia, accused in the past of questionable behaviour, stepped forward, prayed aloud to the gods, and pulled the heavy barge with her bare hands. The novice nearly lifts off her seat with awe. Strength comes in many forms, Lentidia says, sometimes literally. Another name follows, Vestalis Maxima Licinia, a chief Vestal known for managing temple finances with such precision that even Rome's most ambitious accountants envied her records. She once confronted a corrupt official who tried to steal temple funds, and according to sources she shamed him so thoroughly he resigned the next day. Whether or not she also hit him with a broom is, yes, something historians still argue. The novices laugh, and even the senior Vestal's mouth twitches. Then Lentidia mentions Postumia, accused of impurity not for her actions but for her personality. She spoke too freely, Lentidia explains, and laughed too loudly. Some men thought a Vestal should be silent as marble. Postumia was eventually acquitted, but the case became a cautionary tale. Not all accusations were fair. Not all trials were about truth. Some were about control. The novice shifts uncomfortably, recognizing pieces of herself in Postumia. The occasional laugh, the spark of curiosity, the question she swallows. Lentidia reassures them. The goddess knows the heart. The people are more complicated. The scroll continues. Another name rises, Rhea Silvia. Not a Vestal in the traditional sense, but a priestess of Vesta, whose mythic fate gave Rome its legendary founders, Romulus and Remus. Her story blends divinity, violence, and destiny. The novices lean in. Lentidia makes it clear that Rhea Silvia exists partly in myth, partly in early Roman storytelling, but her association with Vesta deeply influenced how Romans viewed the Vestals, as women tied not only to purity but to the birth and preservation of the city itself. The novice shivers at the thought of such symbolic weight. Lentidia closes the scroll, but she doesn't finish the lesson there. She leads the novices through the sanctuary, pointing out spots where famous Vestals once walked, touched, prayed. This corner, she says softly, is where Amelia prayed before restoring the flame. This bench, she notes, is carved with the initials of a Vestal whose name we no longer know, but whose quiet service kept the flame alive through war. This doorway, she adds, was repaired during Licinia's time, after an earthquake. The novice lets her fingers graze the stone as they walk. The walls feel warmer now, alive with memory. Then they reach the temple. Lentidia steps aside, allowing the novices to enter in silence. The sacred flame glows steady, amber and gold. Its warmth dances across their veils. The novice feels something stir in her chest, a realization that she's not simply serving a goddess. She's inheriting a legacy. She's standing in the footprints of giants, of women who were brave, flawed, brilliant, misunderstood, powerful, tragic, miraculous. Lentidia speaks one last time, voice low. Remember their stories. Learn from them. But do not try to become them. Your path will write its own legend. The novice breathes deeply, letting the flame's warm light fill the quiet spaces inside her. For the first time, she wonders, what story will I leave behind? What will future Vestals whisper about me? Outside, the sun dips low, painting the courtyard in soft shadows. Inside, the flame burns on, ancient, patient, and ready to illuminate the next chapter of her life. You feel the shift long before anyone speaks of it. A subtle tension in the sanctuary air, a heaviness in the footsteps of the senior Vestals, a whispering uncertainty drifting in from the streets of Rome like dust on a warm wind. Something is changing, slowly, then quickly, then all at once. And today the novice will begin to understand the long, painful unravelling of a 1,000-year-old institution, the decline of the Vestal Order. It starts with a simple observation as she walks through the forum on an errand. The crowds still part respectfully, but not as completely as before. A few younger Romans glance at her with curiosity, not reverence. Merchants nod politely, but return to their transactions quickly, as though the sacred presence passing them is less urgent than negotiating the price of olives. Even the pigeons seem bolder, strutting closer to her sandals like Lucius has been spreading rumours about her being approachable. The novice senses something unfamiliar, the world shifting beneath her feet. A senior Vestal, Lentidia with her silver braids, asks her to accompany her to fetch ritual oil. As they make their way through the city, Lentidia speaks quietly. "Our place is changing," she says, eyes scanning the forum. "Rome changes. Gods change. Beliefs shift like the Tiber's currents." The novice frowns. "But Vesta is eternal." "Vesta," Lentidia says softly, "is eternal. The Order is not." They stop near a marble column where a group of men debate loudly, something about taxes, something about roads, something about an upcoming imperial decree. One man waves a scroll dramatically, nearly hitting a passerby. You listen closely. The words, "new cults," "imperial religion," and "reforms" drift into the air like storm warnings. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your ear. By the late 4th century CE, Rome's religious landscape was transforming rapidly. Christianity had begun its rise, first tolerated, then accepted, then promoted by emperors who found its structure useful for unifying an empire gone unwieldy. Traditional cults, Jupiter, Mars, Vesta, were no longer the unquestioned heart of Roman identity. They were becoming relics, echoes. Lentidia leads the novice through the forum toward the oil vendor. On the way, they pass a group of Christian preachers speaking passionately about a single God, about salvation, about ritual purity of an entirely different kind. Some Romans stop to listen, others shrug. A few glance at the Vestals with a mixture of pity and skepticism, like old traditions folding slowly under the weight of new promises. The novice pretends not to notice, but Lentidia sees everything. Inside the oil shop, the vendor bows politely, not deeply, not reverently, but politely. "The finest olive oil for the temple," he says, but his tone lacks the old awe. When the novice hands him the bronze vessel to be filled, he hesitates for only a heartbeat. Once he would have trembled at the idea of touching anything destined for the Vestals. Change is here, quiet but relentless. As they walk back, Lentidia explains what the novice has sensed without understanding. The emperors turn toward new gods, she says, new ways, new rules. Her voice remains calm, but her eyes hold a sorrow older than the city itself. Some temples have closed, she adds. Others have lost funding, and the people, some no longer fear the world without our flame. The novice feels her breath catch. The flame, her flame, Rome's flame, losing its meaning. It seems impossible, and yet. They pass a group of children playing in the dust with small carved figurines. One child holds a statue of Venus, another holds a little wooden sheep, a third holds nothing at all, pretending his hands are divine. "I'm the god who can make anything happen," he proclaims loudly. The others laugh, a generation growing up in a world where gods are less defined, less feared, less central. Back in the sanctuary, the novice joins the other Vestals for midday prayers. The flame flickers gently, steady as ever. But today she hears the space differently. The echo feels deeper, the silence feels heavier. Her hands tremble slightly as she offers a pinch of incense. The smoke curls upward as if trying to reach something that is slowly receding. Later, during training, the novices gather for a lesson on ritual history. Instead of scrolls filled with firm declarations, Lentidia unrolls a document with amendments, addendums, edits in multiple hands. Rituals changed before, she explains, adapted, grew, but adaptation cannot always keep pace with the world. She tells them of Emperor Gratian, who recently refused the title of Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, once a role steeped in traditional religious authority. His refusal was symbolic but powerful, a sign that Rome's sacred institutions were losing their anchors. A quirky tidbit slips into the story. Some Romans believed the gods would strike Gratian down for abandoning the old cults, but instead, he remained perfectly fine, leading many to wonder if perhaps the gods were less reactive than previously advertised. Historians still argue whether this lack of immediate divine punishment emboldened more Romans to drift away from the old rites. The novices absorb these changes with unease. Even the flame seems to crackle more sharply today, like it senses the anxiety swirling in the hall. As the day winds down, the novice finds herself in the garden, sitting beneath the olive tree where earlier Vestals carved initials centuries ago. She touches one of the carved letters, weather-worn, softened by time. She wonders whether the girl who carved it feared this kind of future. The senior Vestal joins her quietly. When institutions grow old, Lentidia says, people begin to forget why they mattered. The novice looks up, eyes bright. But the flame is Rome. For 2,000 years, Lentidia agrees, but Rome now seeks a different kind of fire. She gestures toward the distant rooftops, where the shape of a new basilica rises. Their faith spreads, their rituals grow, their leaders challenge ours openly. And the people listen. Some. Enough. The novice swallows hard. Her identity, once unshakable, is shifting like sand beneath her. Lentidia places a warm hand over hers. Do not grieve yet. Our purpose is not gone. Not while the flame still lives. Not while we live. The novice nods, forcing a breath back into her lungs. A small joke moment softens the air. Lucius the pigeon appears, hops onto the novice's sandal, and looks directly into her soul as if saying, "Don't worry. Even if the world ends, I will still demand snacks." She laughs through her worry. Night settles over the sanctuary. The flame burns on, steady, patient, resilient. But outside, the world moves in new directions. Old gods stepping back, new gods stepping forward, and the Vestal standing at the crossroads of a changing Rome. The novice gazes into the fire, seeing its reflection flicker in her eyes. She whispers a prayer, not for miracles, not for power, but for endurance. Because she senses the truth. Change is coming, and she will have to face it. You follow the novice Vestal into a morning that feels strangely hollow, as if the city has exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. Rome still stands, grand, immense, buzzing with life, but something in the air is different, thinner, fragile, like a thread pulled too many times. And today she will witness the moment that once seemed impossible, the approach of the end, the day when the eternal flame, Rome's heartbeat for nearly 1,000 years, faces its final extinguishing. It starts not with trumpets or proclamations, but with whispers, quiet ones, the kind that ripple through a crowd not because people want to gossip, but because they're afraid to say something aloud in their normal voices. As the novice walks through the forum with a senior Vestal, she notices people glancing toward the temple with expressions she's never seen before. Sympathy, confusion, even guilt. A group of men stand in a tight cluster discussing an imperial decree. The words funding withdrawn, temple assets reassigned, and imperial reforms drift toward her like cold drafts. The novice freezes, the senior Vestal's hand tightening gently around hers, steadying, grounding. This is the decree she had long feared. The state, now aligned with the new Christian faith, will no longer support the Temple of Vesta. A mainstream historical fact surfaces above the unease. In 394 CE, Theodosius IV banned pagan practices throughout the empire and dissolved many traditional cults, among them the Vestal Order. After centuries of protected status, legal privileges, and sacred duty, the Vestals were told their service had ended. The novice feels her heartbeat quicken. "Ended?" she whispers. "But the flame, the senior Vestal says softly, will go out." Those words settle over the novice like winter frost. She's never imagined Rome without that gentle glow licking the sacred hearth, never imagined waking to darkness in the temple, never imagined silence where the fire had crackled day and night, century after century. They return to the sanctuary where the elder Vestals gather, not in panic, not in tears, but in solemn stillness. Some sit near the fountain, others linger in the corridor. A few clasp hands, silent but united. Lentidia stands at the center, her silver braids shimmering like threads of moonlight. "The Emperor has spoken," she says. "We are to complete our final day of service. Tonight, the flame is to be extinguished." A hush falls that feels less like silence and more like stunned disbelief. The novice's breath trembles. But Vesta, what will become of her? Lentidia kneels before her, taking her hands. Vesta is older than Rome, older than temples, older than us. Her flame burns in every hearthfire, every home. The goddess remains. It is only our service that ends. Historians still argue whether the emperor intended this moment to be symbolic cleansing, political consolidation, or simply administrative efficiency. But to the women standing here, it feels like grief wearing the robes of duty. The day unfolds in slow, deliberate rhythms. The novice sweeps the hearth, One last time. She arranges the incense one last time. She ties the ritual cords into knots that will never again be used. She washes her hands in the sacred fountain, each drop of water feeling heavier than it should. The elder, Vestals guide her through each task as though performing a final dance choreographed across centuries. In the courtyard, Lucius the pigeon perches on a broken column, watching with what looks suspiciously like quiet respect. Even he seems to feel the shift. As dusk approaches, the Vestals gather inside the round temple. The sacred flame burns brightly, unaware of its fate. Its crackling echoes softly in the chamber, a sound so familiar the novice feels it carved into her bones. Lentidia steps forward. She holds a small bronze ladle filled with pure water. Cool, shimmering, silent. This ladle has been used in countless purification rites, but never this one. The novice stands behind her, heart pounding. Her hands tremble, not with fear, but with reverence and sorrow. The fire reflects in her eyes, making them glow like twin embers. One last quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Some ancient writers believed the sacred flame could not be extinguished by ordinary means, that it resisted, that it sputtered defiantly, that Vesta herself recoiled from such endings. Whether this is literal truth or poetic disbelief, scholars still argue, but standing here, you feel the flame's warmth pulse like a living thing. Lentidia raises the ladle. The temple holds its breath. Even Rome outside seems to fall silent for a single heartbeat. "You have burned for centuries," Lentidia whispers, her voice steady. "May your light remain in every hearth, every home, every heart that remembers." The ladle tilts. A thin stream of water falls, soft, gentle, almost tender. The flame hisses, flares, struggles. The novice inhales sharply, a tiny gasp pulled from her chest. Then, the flame collapses into a curl of smoke, a wisp of grey drifting upward, vanishing through the opening in the temple roof. The sacred hearth is dark. The novice reaches out instinctively, her fingers hovering above the warm stone. She closes her eyes, feeling both the end and the beginning in the lingering heat. Outside, the city goes on. People argue about grain prices. Dogs bark. A cartwheel squeaks. Life continues, indifferent to the sacred ceremony unfolding in the shadows. The Vestals remain still for a long moment, the silence wrapping around them like a soft shroud. Finally, Lentidia speaks. "Our service ends tonight. You are free." The novice opens her eyes. Free? The word feels foreign, too large, too heavy, too sudden. The elder Vestals escort her back to the atrium. They extinguish the lamps, fold the veils, close the doors, pack away scrolls that will no longer be read. Their movements are slow but graceful, like turning the final pages of a long and beloved book. As they walk, a small joke moment flickers in to soften the grief. Lucius swoops down to land on the novice's shoulder, pecking at her braid as if reminding her she still has lunch crumbs to offer. She laughs shakily, grateful for the distraction. By the time night settles fully, the atrium house feels larger and emptier. Quiet. Too quiet. The novice sits beside the fountain, her sanctuary from the beginning, and watches ripples dance in the torchlight. The flame is gone, but she is not. And though her vow ends tonight, the memory of her service will burn in her like a hidden ember. Tomorrow, she will walk into a world she has never known, without a veil, without a temple, without the constant whisper of sacred fire. Tonight, she whispers a final prayer into the still air. "Thank you." And somewhere, in 1,000 hearths across Rome, flames flicker in reply. You step with the former novice, now simply a young woman, out into a Rome that feels both familiar and changed, like a dream you've woken from but can still half inhabit. The sacred flame is gone, the sanctuary quiet, but another journey is beginning. Today she wanders not through ceremonies or lessons or duties, but through memory made physical, the remnants of the temple of Vesta itself. You follow close behind as she learns how the sanctuary has begun to transform from a living religious centre into something else, an archaeological whisper, a set of stones holding stories instead of rituals. The morning sun glints across the forum, gilding columns, statues, and broken pedestals. The city stirs slowly, vendors lifting shutters, children laughing as they chase each other past the Basilica Julia, a dog barking at a passing cart like it's personally offended by wheels. But near the temple, the atmosphere feels hushed, contemplative, as if the earth here remembers. The young woman pauses at the edge of the round foundation, now exposed bare, the central hearth long cold. For a moment she hesitates, unsure whether she's allowed to enter as a visitor rather than a guardian. But Lentidia, walking beside her, gives a small nod of permission. It belongs to memory now, she says, and memory belongs to all. They step inside. The first thing she notices is the shape, the unmistakable circular design like a womb of stone. A mainstream historical fact flickers gently into your awareness. The Temple of Vesta was one of the oldest structures in Rome, its round shape echoing early Italic huts and symbolizing the hearth at the center of every household. Even emperors honored this ancient design, rebuilding it multiple times over centuries but preserving its essential form. Now, the once polished marble is weathered. Some columns lean, others have collapsed. The roof is long gone, leaving only blue sky where once smoke curled upward into the compluvium. The altar stone remains, its surface darkened, smooth from centuries of tending. The young woman kneels to place her palm upon it. It's cool now. Too cool. A light breeze whispers through the ruins, stirring dust and lifting strands of her hair. Everything feels larger now, emptier, but also strangely peaceful, like visiting the home of an old friend long after they've moved away. Lentidia guides her to the left, toward the remnants of a storage chamber. Here, archaeologists of a much later age would uncover fragments, potsherds, burnt grain, bits of incense residue. But today, the room simply feels hollow. The young woman runs her fingers along the grooves in the walls where shelves once stood. She remembers placing jars there, sealing them with clay, checking them every morning. A quirky tidbit floats to mind. Ancient Romans believed that certain sacred objects kept in this temple, perhaps the palladium, perhaps ritual tools, were so protected that to disturb them improperly would bring divine wrath. Whether that was literal belief or state-sponsored intimidation, historians still argue, but now the shelf spaces are empty, their secrets long removed or lost to time. They move deeper into the ruins. A low stone border marks where the sacred hearth once stood. She steps over it, each footfall echoing softly. The ground within is darkened from centuries of flame. Even after the fire's extinction, the earth holds the memory of heat. She kneels, touching the soot-darkened soil. For a moment her breath catches, not from grief alone, but from wonder. So much of her life centered on this hearth. Its warmth shaped her days, its glow guided her nights. And now she sees it from the outside, as an artifact, not a responsibility. Nearby, Lentidia gestures toward architectural details half buried in the earth. Fluted column fragments, carved marble blocks, a piece of cornice with delicate acanthus leaves. This temple was rebuilt many times, she explains. Fire, earthquake, war, and always it rose again. Rome believed the flame must survive, no matter what. The young woman stands and walks toward the broken columns. She traces the grooves with her fingertips, feeling the roughness where smoothness once lived. The marble is chipped, pitted, weathered by time and politics alike. But even in ruin, it carries beauty, a quiet endurance that mirrors the Vestals themselves. A group of ordinary citizens passes by, glancing curiously at the ruins. One man says something about the temple becoming a historic marker. Another remarks that it might soon be dismantled for stone. A woman, older, pauses and presses her hand to her chest, whispering a small farewell prayer. The young woman watches, touched. Vesta's memory persists in hearts, even as rituals fade. Historians still argue whether the final extinguishing of the sacred flame caused panic among Romans, or whether many had already embraced the empire's new religious direction. Whatever the case, the temple itself became a symbol, not of living fire, but of Rome's layered past. As the young woman explores the outer walkway, she notices engravings still faintly visible on certain stones, dedication inscriptions, repairs noted under various emperors, even faint decorative patterns. Time has softened them, but not erased them. She wonders if this will happen to her own memories, faded perhaps, but never fully gone. Lentidia guides her toward the house of the Vestals, now eerily silent. The pool in the courtyard still reflects the sky, but without daily footsteps, without the soft murmur of ritual, it feels like a pool in a dream. The young woman walks around the perimeter, pausing at familiar spots. The mosaic where she used to sit with other novices, the herb garden, the alcove where Lucius the pigeon used to demand snacks. Look at that. He appears now, fluttering onto a fallen column. He coos at her as if to say, well, the snacks aren't going to offer themselves. She laughs softly and tosses him a crumb she saved. Some things don't change. They wander into one of the abandoned dormitories. Dust drapes everything like a thin veil. A few beds remain, wooden frames now creaking with age. On one shelf sits a clay tablet dropped hurriedly years ago and never retrieved. The young woman picks it up. It bears a faint tally, perhaps incense rations from a decade past. Everything here feels suspended, paused, waiting for the world to decide whether to remember or forget. Outside, Lentidia gestures toward the upper floors, once home to the senior Vestals. Archaeologists someday will dig here, she says, voice wistful. They'll find fragments, a carved bone needle, a piece of scorched wood, a bead from a broken veil. And they'll wonder, the young woman whispers. Yes, Lentidia says, and wondering is a kind of remembrance. The two walk back toward the temple one last time. The afternoon sun casts long shadows through the columns, painting dark spokes across the round floor. The young woman stands at the entrance, her silhouette framed by the sky. This place was once my entire world, she says softly. And now? She inhales. The air smells of stone, dust and distant bread from a market stall. Life. Now it is part of my story, she says, but not all of it. Lentidia smiles, proud. The young woman turns her back on the ruins, not rejecting them, but carrying them with her. She steps into the forum, into noise, into life, into the living Rome that still exists beyond sacred fire. Behind her, the temple rests, silent, empty, enduring. Not dead, just historical. And as she walks forward, she doesn't look back again. She doesn't need to. The memory burns brighter in her than any hearth could. You follow her into a Rome that feels strangely bright. Bright not only with sunlight, but with the sense that she is finally seeing the world without a veil, without boundaries, without the echo of ritual threading through every step. Today is not a lesson, not a ceremony, not a farewell. It's an exploration of something she has never been allowed to imagine until now. How the memory of the Vestal Virgins echoes into the future, into art, ritual, metaphor, and the quieter corners of human imagination. She walks slowly through the forum, no longer in sacred robes, no longer moving with the measured pace of duty. Her stride is her own. Her direction is her own. Her breath, her schedule, her choices, all her own. But as she wanders, she begins to notice something unexpected. Even without the flame, even without the temple operating, the idea of the Vestals hasn't vanished. People whisper it, people reference it, people feel it. A group of schoolchildren passes by, their tutor pointing at the ruins. There, he says, gesturing dramatically toward the round temple, the home of the eternal flame, tended by the purest maidens in Rome. The kids stare, wide-eyed, imagining miracles and ancient discipline. One boy asks if they could still bring back the order. The tutor chuckles, shaking his head, but you can see admiration lingering in his eyes. The young woman watches, quietly surprised. Her life, something she thought had ended, still sparks stories in others. A mainstream historical fact rises gently. The Vestals became symbols long after their dissolution. Medieval scholars wrote about them. Renaissance artists painted them. Enlightenment writers debated them. Were they empowered women or controlled ones? Sacred symbols or political pawns? Their memory survived wars, plagues, dynasties, and the shifting of empires. The flame went out, but the idea kept burning. She walks past a sculptor's workshop next. In the open doorway stands a half-finished statue of a woman in draped robes. The sculptor wipes his hands, noticing her gaze. A Vestal, he explains, commissioned by a merchant who thinks it will bring virtue to his household. He chuckles, as if marble alone could do that. Yet his voice carries a note of respect. The young woman steps closer, marveling at how the artist has captured the serenity she once practiced. A calm face, a lowered gaze, a veil that seems to float even though it's carved from stone. A quirky tidbit slips into place. Centuries later, poets and playwrights will treat Vestals as symbols of purity so exaggerated that modern readers would barely recognize the real women behind them. Some fictional Vestals will be heroic, some tragic, some comically dramatic. Scholars still argue which portrayals do justice to history and which are just creative liberties disguised as research. But the very fact they remain subjects of fascination long after the fire faded is its own kind of immortality. As she leaves the workshop, a band of travelling performers arrives in the forum. Their show includes a comedic sketch, two actors pretending to be clumsy acolytes, trying to keep a symbolic flame alive while the wind keeps blowing it out. The audience laughs. Even the young woman cracks a smile. The memory of the Vestals has shifted from sacred fear to gentle parody. But even parody requires admiration. After all, no one jokes about something truly forgotten. She continues down the street toward the home of a former patron, passing households where women cook over hearths glowing with steady fire. She pauses, watching the flames dance. Lentidia's words echo in her memory. Vesta is older than the temple. She lives in every hearth. And the young woman realizes that this is true. The sacredness of fire, of warmth, of home, persists long after the institutional rituals fade. Near the market, she overhears a conversation between two merchants discussing an upcoming festival. Not for the gods, one says dismissively, but for tradition. People still bake cakes with sacred flour, still clean their homes as if preparing for Vestalia, still wear white on certain days. Even without priests or decrees, the cultural ripples remain. Historians still argue whether modern hearth rituals, lighting candles for household blessings, keeping a fire burning for luck, using flame in weddings, descend from Vesta's cult or from older Indo-European fire traditions, but the echoes overlap so neatly that even scholars can't untangle them cleanly. Fire is universal. But the Vestals made it unforgettable. The young woman wanders toward a villa where a wealthy widow lives. The woman greets her warmly, explaining she's hosting a gathering that evening. Philosophers, poets, scholars. They want to hear about your life, the widow says, not the myths, your real memories. The young woman hesitates, then nods. She's not sure her story matters, but maybe stories don't have to be grand to be powerful. As she walks home to prepare, Lucius the pigeon swoops down onto her shoulder, naturally without warning. She laughs because, of course, even in a new life, this bird refuses to let her be too serious. She feeds him a grain from her pocket, and he coos with the smugness of a creature convinced he is the true guardian of Rome's memory. By evening, she finds herself seated in a quiet room with scrolls scattered on the table. Scholars lean in, hungry for details. She tells them about sweeping the hearth, grinding sacred flour, practicing stillness during rituals, fumbling the sieve during her first week. They laugh, they question, they marvel. One poet scribbles furiously, muttering something about a future epic. Another asks if she'll pose for a painting. She declines, with a smile, but appreciates the sentiment. And as she speaks, she realizes something profound. Her life may have changed, her order may have ended, but her story continues, alive in the memories of others. Somewhere in Rome, artists carve Vestals from marble. Elsewhere, priests borrow their symbolism for new rituals. Everywhere, hearths glow with echoes of the flame she once tended. She steps outside after the gathering, the night warm, the city calm. She looks up at the stars, steadier than any empire, older than any cult, and feels no grief now, just connection. Her duty is over, her life is beginning. But the legacy she carried, it lingers everywhere, not as a burden, not as a command, but as a quiet, enduring fire. A fire that has moved from the temple into stories, art, rituals, imaginations, and into the hearts of all who remember. The night settles softly over Rome, the kind of night that feels like a warm exhale after a long, storied day. The streets dim, one oil lamp at a time, until the darkness gathers gently between the marble columns and the tiled rooftops. You feel the city easing into stillness, its pulse slowing. its stories curling up like quiet embers. You walk with her one last time, not toward a temple or a ceremony, but simply through the calm. The air is warm, touched with the faint scent of bread, cooling in bakery windows and distant jasmine drifting from courtyard gardens. Her steps are unhurried now, no sacred duties pulling her forward, no rituals marking her hours, just her own rhythm, soft and steady, like a lullaby humming beneath the world. As she pauses near a quiet fountain, the surface of the water reflects the moon in a trembling ribbon of silver. She touches the edge lightly, letting tiny ripples fan outward. The night answers her touch with a serene stillness, as if the city itself is whispering a slow, gentle thank you. And you realize that nothing is truly lost. Not the flame, not the duty, not the centuries of devotion. Everything that mattered has found a quieter home. Here in the soft dark, in the hush between footsteps, in the flicker of memories carried by those who still walk beneath these stars. Your breath loosens, your shoulders sink a little deeper. The world fades into softer shapes and slower sounds. Even the stones seem to sigh. So let the story dim now, the way a candle settles into its last warm glow. Let the quiet wrap around you. Let your thoughts drift like smoke, rising into a peaceful sky. The journey is complete, the flame rests, and so can you. And